precious guest, we have Professor Amrit Sen. Let me take the Mukhopadhyay and Visva-Bharati Fraser, Youth Press, Scotland, 2017. The Scottish Enlightenment and the Bengal Renaissance, the Continuum of Ideas, co-edited with Dr. Mukhopadhyay and Visva-Bharati Fraser, Scotland, 2017, and Shantiniketan for visitors, Visva-Bharati, 2017, and the Bengali chemist Acharya Prafulla Chandra Rai and Post-Coloniality, Karigor, 2017. And Vasundhara, Rabindranath Tagore and the Environment, Visva-Bharati, 2018. He is joint coordinator of the UKIERI project on the Scotland-India Continuum, Tagore and his circle, and the deputy coordinator of the UGC SAP project on Rabindranath Tagore, the East-West Confluence at the Department of English. Apart from his academic engagement, he has also translated and performed in Tagore's dance dramas at national and international stages. He is presently also joint editor of the Visva-Bharati portal. Among his major awards, he has won the Outstanding Thesis Award by the Government of India, the Research Award by the UGC, the Oxford 18th Century Bursary, and a host of academic recognition. He has traveled extensively as project coordinator for the UKIERI Award to Edinburgh, Scotland, as invited speaker to the University of Oxford and Swinton, Chongji University, Shanghai, China, as has also delivered the Tagore Memorial Lecture at the Rabindranath Center under the Mahatma Gandhi Institute at Mauritius. Professor Amrit Sen is also presently officiating as the director of Grantha Vibhag, the publication wing of Visva-Bharati since July 2018. On that note, let me ask Professor Amrit Sen to take over as the keynote speaker for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you are absolutely audible.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Basu. It's my great privilege to share this Google Meet with somebody whom I've always considered as one of my mentors, Professor Shubhir Dhar, and of course, a host of other participants, peers, and I'm sure students of this new university, which will, I'm sure, go a long way. Now, we have 8 very interesting papers waiting for us, and I was quite thrilled to read the abstracts. So I will limit myself and my comments to approximately 20 minutes. And I have prepared a small introduction, as it were, to the questions that some of these papers also raise and some which have crossed my mind when I have extensively tried to read Rabindranath's prose writings and the translations in English. Now, there are a few basic questions that I'm asking. Why translation? I'm saying, why did Rabindranath indulge in these translations, and why have subsequent translations been done? What were translated? This is a very important question, especially with reference to Rabindranath's prose writings. You know, not all Rabindranath's prose writings, in fact, of all his writings, the prose writings have been probably the maximum. But in terms of translation, in terms of percentages, it has been the minimum. So what is this gap in translation, and what exactly are the prose writings that have been translated? How have they been translated? That's the next question that I'll put forward. Has the progress of history and the changed cultural studies perspectives affected this process of translation? And how have these translations been received and circulated is the last question that I'm going to probably put forward before you. Now, It's interesting that I don't have any firm answers and should not have really. But I'm going to pose these questions and try and answer them in my way and open it for discussion if time later on permits. But I would begin by pointing out that in terms of Rabindranath and translation, we very often go by the letter that he wrote to Indira Devi Chodurani, where he was talking about translation as suddenly occasioned by a bout of laziness and illness. You see, I don't agree with that. Rabindranath, of course, poses it in this way, but we have to remember a few things. That this process of Rabindranath and translation needs to be contextualized also in terms of the overall ambience within which Rabindranath was flourishing. And that is the Bengal Renaissance and the Tagore household. Please remember that the Bengal Renaissance was characterized by its bilingual nature right from Raja Ram Mohan Roy onwards. There were translation and writing in English was one of its key features of the East-West encounter. And the Tagore household, of course, used this extensively, especially because of its sequence of visitors, very often from abroad, including not only England, but of course, as you know, Japan and China. And at a very young age. So the process of translation and the familiarity of translation was available to Rabindranath at a very young age. That is, his translation of Irish and Scottish melodies into Bangla. You see, this translation of music and its lyrics is another dimension which very few scholars of Rabindranath have looked at. And the way in which Rabindranath was continuously playing with different lyrics on the same tune, thereby creating different translated texts, is something which is worthy of noting. So my point being that translation was intrinsic to Rabindranath's process of growing up. This is my first point. The second is that when we look at the first texts that Rabindranath is actually translating, and please remember this, that Rabindranath's prose translations have a huge corpus of auto-translations. He translated his texts himself into English. The first being very obviously Sadhana. Now, many of you might immediately conjecture that Sadhana is an original English text. Why do I call it a translation? Because Rabindranath was trying to translate his major philosophy into, and for a Christian audience in America. Therefore, this process of translation of a religious idea into what was an audience that was marked by Christian Unitarianism is something we have to keep in mind as also part of the Brahmo Samaj tradition which was indulging in this process. Therefore, the inspirations of Rabindranath's prose translations, at least initially, were drawn from efforts which were already being made as part of the Brahmo Samaj. The third thing that I would like to point out is that the East-West encounter was creating what we can call a systematic opening up of prose forms. What were these prose forms? Of course, there was the novel, which Rabindranath was experimenting with, which Bankim Chandra, of course, had started in Bangla already. There was, of course, the travelogue and the new travelogue to the West that Rabindranath talked about and wrote extensively. We have a paper on the Russian travelogue of Rabindranath. There was the autobiography. We remember that Rabindranath had two major autobiographical writings to his credit, and he insisted that these be translated into English. And very importantly, which the most significant number of papers have here focused upon, the short story, where Rabindranath was himself a pioneer. Therefore, to understand the corpus of prose translations, it is important also to understand the sudden proliferation of new prose forms that were available to the Bengali intelligentsia at this point of time. We'll also have to remember, and I'm sure yesterday it has been talked about, that from the 1890s, late 1890s onwards, there was a group of his close associates who were already indulging in this process of translation. We will include, of course, here Robi Dotto, Chukumar Roy, Jagadish Bose, Sister Nivedita. And therefore, with these translations circulating and Rabindranath interacting with many of them, in fact, not being pleased with many of these translations, the need for translating his texts himself, of conveying his own ideas to a wider public, became imperative. Now, very interestingly, we need to, especially in the case of prose translations, also look at the publication of an important journal that provoked and provided space for Rabindranath to translate his works. And this was in 1907, Ramananda Chatterjee initiating the Modern Review. The Modern Review, of course, as you will remember, became the most important and significant English journal of the times, where between 1909 and 1912, 15 short stories, 3 essays of Rabindranath were published. The translators included Jadunath Sarkar, very importantly, Sister Nivedita, Ajit Chakraborty, Loken Palit, Devendranath Mitra. Incidentally, Robinstein read the translation of Devendranath Mitra of the Postmaster, which provoked such an interest in Rabindranath, and Tagore himself. Now, this is also very interesting, the process of translation, how they were translated. Very often, many of these were translated in collaboration with the author. And I'm going to talk about two varieties of translation a little later on. But these were translations where Rabindranath was participating to a large extent in the process of, in the selection and process of translation. So we have 3 kinds, or rather 4 kinds of translations in prose made by the poet. Secondly, in collaboration with others. Third, by others of the contemporary times. And fourthly, by more recent translators who were dissatisfied with the qualities of the earlier translations. So we actually have 4 varieties of translations emerging and circulating in terms of prose writings. Post-Gitanjali, of course, and I'm sure this too has been discussed yesterday, Rabindranath became a global celebrity. And as Shishir Kumar Das points out, Rabindranath's more public voice becomes very evident. This is also the time when Rabindranath is moving from translating his religious ideas. His religious ideas were, of course, being translated in 2 basic texts. One was Sadhana, the other was Personality, to a more political voice. And this is where some of his most important, what we can call political texts emerge as translations. And that is his lectures on nationalism, The Home and the World. Gora has been translated by William Pearson. And therefore, we have a new Rabindranath, as it were, emerging post 1916, who is much more politically committed, who is interacting with the ideas of nationalism and internationalism, and therefore engaging in a whole new dimension of thought. I would then move on to another Rabindranath, who goes on to translate his ideas about art, aesthetics, and the importance of the poet's religion. And in this corpus, I would include the translations of his Religion of Man, the Hibbert lectures that he delivered, and tried to translate many of the ideas of his theory of the interaction of the divine in the human and the human in the divine. Now, this is another theoretical point which Tagore's translations keep on talking about. There's, of course, a major translation that he makes of the message of the forest and some of his very important ecological ideas, on which we do have a paper later on. Therefore, it's very interesting that this is another dimension of Rabindranath's translated texts. Finally, I would like to talk about the last texts that Rabindranath would translate, including The Crisis in Civilization, which advocate or somewhere talk about his final faith in man, and yet reveal a deepening sense of disquiet and discord about the fate of humanity. So these are the four phases through which Rabindranath's own texts were being translated by himself and his contemporaries. Interestingly, as all of you know, the choice of these texts was very often made by Rabindranath. The other texts that were being translated, The Home and the World, of course, became the cult translated text that was available to his contemporaries. And in many ways, Rabindranath had encouraged this translation, as well as Churan Tagore's translation of My Reminiscences, to project his own perspective. You see, this is very interesting. I find this very interesting. Here is a poet who has won the Nobel Prize and is being translated throughout as a poet of mysticism. Why did Rabindranath, encourage these translations of The Home and the World, My Reminiscences, and other texts, in fact, asking Pearson to translate Goda, is probably because he was trying to move away from the kind of garb that the West had put on him as merely a mystical poet. There were also translations where he was in many ways translating his own writings in Visva-Bharati, in My University, and other writings, where he was consciously trying to project his own ideas about education, about his institution. There were other essays which were delivered very often based on certain notes. For example, Talks in China, which he was retracting later on and publishing them in a new way. There's an interesting letter, in fact, when he writes Europe Probashir Potro, which was published, if you remember, in Bengali for the first time in 1881. And he was, 1878, and later on also in the 1930s. And he was suggesting that, for an author, the process of revision and translation is a continuous one. Therefore, there are many texts of Rabindranath which he edited, amended, and retranslated himself. Tomorrow, of course, Rakta Korobi is going to be discussed, and I'm sure this issue will be coming back. Right, so therefore, it's a process of translation and continuous correction that Rabindranath was indulging in. There's, of course, another group of writings which I have not talked about. Interestingly, some of these writings were translated under the supervision of Rabindranath by Rabindranath Tagore, is his letters. And his reminiscences of Bengal and Rabindranath Tagore's translations of these letters, incidentally, were leading on to the familiarity of Tagore's intimate moments, his interactions with nature, and trying to create a context in which the short stories were being made or were being created. If you remember William Radice talking about how jol, sthal, these categories become imperative for his writings of the short stories. Which brings me, of course, to the politics of translation. Now, of all his writings, especially in prose, the most significantly translated category has been the short stories. In fact, if you will remember that post-1950s, largely Rabindranath's prose writings have not been translated anew. It's poetry and drama which has received much more attention. But when these writings were being translated, when the short stories were being translated, what were the short stories that were chosen? The short stories that were chosen were inevitably those which talked about, human interest that was transnational, the example of which would largely be Kabuliwala. There were short stories which largely were, talked about art and artifice, which were being translated. But the political short stories of Rabindranath, in fact, Megh Orodhro was a short story that was translated, but that was not included by the Macmillan editors for the collection of short stories of Tagore. So obviously, within the colonial system, we have a Tagore whose short stories on women, on human considerations are being translated and published, but whose political dimensions were largely ignored. In fact, Rabindranath had to repeatedly write about Sriniketan, his efforts at building Shantiniketan, to translate his ideas for a Western audience for the sake of his school and also for the sake of his larger university system and the effort that he was trying to make. Now, what we see here, therefore, is a glut of translations on poetry, especially Gitanjali. A significant number of translations ideas to a Western audience. In fact, Shishir Das notes this point that in his poetry and poetic translations, Rabindranath was controlling the language. Whenever he moved to translating his ideas in prose, he was governed by language itself. But if you take a look at the ways in which Rabindranath was translating his prose, and if you take a kind of a survey, you will find that Rabindranath's use of metaphors, for example, changes very considerably. For example, in Creative Unity or Sadhana, Rabindranath is talking about breaking down the walls, is talking about the communion with nature in a far free-flowing English prose. Yet when he's moving to nationalism, his prose becomes critical and is marked by a very powerful system of irony. In The Religion of Man again, Rabindranath's prose becomes far simpler, far more lucid when he's talking about the ways in which, the bowls, for example, represent the idea of a religion that belongs to the folk. And in the last writings, again, Crisis in Civilization, you will find a Rabindranath who is extremely bitter, a Rabindranath who seems to be almost despondent. Therefore, even in his practice of prose writings, in his practice of translating his ideas into prose, Rabindranath changes as these moments, as per the moments in his career. It's also very interesting to see how the politics of translation happens. In fact, when Rabindranath writes Rashiyar Chithi, there is no hue and cry at all by the press. It is only when the English translation appears in the Modern Review in one particular issue that the British the British government actually suppresses Rashiyar Chithi completely. Therefore, censorship comes in with translation. Whenever Rabindranath's works become problematic to the government, to the British audience, as it were, it is there that censorship arrives and tries to suppress translation. Now, unquestionably, Rabindranath's translated works have led to his great popularity outside, but once again, the paucity of prose works of Rabindranath make him only a poet of Gitanjali in certain quarters. It is in respect to that more modern translations of Rabindranath have come out. But I would once again argue that these translations have largely focused only on the short stories and the novels of Rabindranath. We have failed to read into some of his major prose works which are in Bangla, including the Shantiniketan lectures, for example, which are the greatest repositories of his ideas. Only a fraction of them were translated in Shadhana, and that too in terms of the idea. That is a rich repository which we have failed to translate. We have also failed to translate a large body of writings on ecology. His significant writings of the travelogues remain largely untranslated. And this is a process that Visva-Bharati has undertaken to circulate his ideas about internationalism. And a lot of his letters to various people which reflect or reveal a more intimate Rabindranath remain untranslated. For example, I myself am looking at volume 4 of Rabindranath's letters, which were written to his children, which remain splendid, examples of writings which were specifically directed towards younger people. And there's a large body of literature for young adults that Rabindranath wrote, a large body of satire that still remains untranslated into English. Therefore, I would say that in terms of prose translations, we have a surfeit of translations in terms of certain genres, but in other specific areas, other specific genres, as it were, within prose literature, Rabindranath is largely known by his own translations, and a body and a corpus of translations remain yet unplumbed. It is this gap, probably, that we need to trace to see a Rabindranath who is beyond the mystical poet, who was politically engaged, who was ecologically conscious, and who had to make extensive comments about the religion of man, art and aesthetics, for example. So it is this body of prose writing that largely waits to be translated by scholars and readers of Rabindranath. It is with these words that I would like to conclude my short address. And if there are, I know that this is not the tradition for a keynote to be open to question, but if Shubidha and Moni Kinkini allows, maybe we could have one or two moments of discussion so that, I too get some feedback from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the extremely comprehensive and a very enlightening paper. And I use these words meaningfully, not just as politeness. The reason is, you see, as you rightly pointed out, there are several dimensions of Tagore which haven't been translated and which are literally crying out to be translated. I particularly found fascinating your idea about how Tagore's English prose changes with the subjects that he's dealing with. Obviously, this is a conception in the mind of a person, a creator if you want, who's very conscious of the reception of his work in a colonial setup. Obviously, he was very conscious about censorship. Obviously, he was also conscious that the British government was keeping a look on his movement. And in fact, there was a file in Lal Bazar which was marked in Tagore's name, and there was some kind of surveillance going on. And he knew this. But thank you very much. I certainly have learned a great deal, and I think your suggestions open up vistas of new research, which once again should be and can be and may be taken up by future scholars. Thank you, Amrit. Very, very
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, on that note, with Professor Baur's permission, sir, should we take a question that is there in the chat box for Amrit?
Yes, of course. Do that.
Actually, Sanjana Plawat was inquiring after this speech whether Amrit sir could please tell the names of a few untranslated satires of Tagore.
Well, you have a whole body of satires that Rabindranath wrote, but you will find that a large number of smaller satires like Shea, for example, have not been translated. There are a few pieces where Rabindranath, in fact, talks about the arjos, the division between arjos and onarjos in society, which he was writing about. These are smaller pieces that came out in Bharati, for example. These were largely written in a lighter vein. There are satires which he wrote also in Shobuj Patro, which are smaller ones, which are very small articles, which talk about, the concept of the arjo, and he was making fun also. Rabindranath was making fun also of the ways in which Bengalis have often talked about keeping women in the Antapur. There are passages, for example, in Europe Prabashir Patro, which has just recently been translated, where there's an extensive satire on the Ingo Bongo, the hybrid Bengali, and the way in which he sort of considers everything English to be perfect, while everything Bengali is to be rejected, right? So there is and I would also like to remind you that there was an extensive interaction between Rabindranath and Dijendranath, his elder brother. Dijendranath protested and said that you need to respect tradition. Rabindranath shot back letters saying no, until and unless we sort of bring women into the forefront, there is no possibility. There are also his novels, for example, where he's making fun of, the Swadeshi experiments, which blindly tried to sort of make matchboxes, for example. And he was talking about a more concerted effort, which would be economically viable, so that this would be possible. This is a text which was in Bengali called Chirokumar Shapa, and this has just very recently, over the last 2 years, been translated.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I think we had a brilliant session. Thank you so much. And even Sanjana Plawat writes, thank you, sir. So the question is answered clearly. Now, on that note, we would like to inform our paper presenters that Professor Amrit Sen has kindly consented to be the chair for your session, which I think will be an enlightening one, because he's obviously going to guide us through the beautiful journey of today's webinar. And I would like to thank Professor Shubidhar for being the mentor and advisor on this particular aspect, where he has also asked Amrita to kindly consent for this particular job. Thank you, everyone, for your being present from the morning. And we start our session of paper presenters. And we have a student volunteer. Now, there are certain things that we need to keep in mind because this is a webinar. You will have 15 minutes of time to present your paper. And after which, there will be a warning, a written warning in the chat box provided by the student volunteer for today, which is Shomopriya Shaha. After that, you will have 2 more minutes to wrap your paper up. So after the 17th minute, there will be a verbal warning for you from Shomopriya's end. So we would request you to kindly wrap up the paper in the stipulated time, because we have 8 papers to go. And obviously, we don't have a lunch break. So it means that we will all be starving to death if we do not be a little more considerate towards each other. On that note, without wasting time, I would like to invite the first speaker, Dr. Animesh Rai, Assistant Professor, St. Xavier's College, Jharkhand.
And Monica, can you just tell the paper presenters that we will have questions at the end of the session?
Oh, yes, please. Once we're done with the entire session, we will have the question-answer session. Thank you so much, everyone. And now we begin. Thank you, sir.
Right. Okay, Animesh, are you there? Animesh? Hello?
I can see Professor Dr. Roy here, but Dr. Roy, would you please leave the meeting and join again in case you cannot unmute yourself? Because that way you can...
Unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, unmute yourself, or else leave the meeting and join again. You can unmute yourself in that way, if it's a problem. Yes, he has left the meeting. I think he is going to rejoin.
Well, technology does provide us enormous opportunity, but as I found out today, if it fails us, it becomes a nightmare. Anyway, Dr. Roy is back.
No, you are still not audible.
Can you please unmute yourself?
Okay, as we have some technical glitch with Dr. Roy, could we have the second speaker go first, with your permission?
I think that's a better idea. I think that's a better idea.
In that case, I think we will have Sanjana Plawat, the second speaker, PhD research scholar, Department of English, Strawberry University. Sanjana?
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for providing the opportunity to present my ideas. Good afternoon, everyone. In fact, it's good morning right now. My name is Amrit Sen. I am a PhD research scholar at Georgia University. The topic of my presentation is the conflict of patriotism and cosmopolitanism in Rabindranath Tagore's The Home and the World. The struggle to maintain a proper balance between the personal and the social life is a quintessential part of it. And if taken on a broader pedestal, this dilemma takes the overtones of the nationalism and the cosmopolitanism. This struggle finds its mention in various works of Rabindranath Tagore with novel The Home and the World, published originally in Bengali in 1916, taking the equation to a unique level, which holds relevance even after a century of the composition of the novel. Imbued with Tagore's autobiographical connotations and the recurring theme of the clash between the personal and the political, the novel is an allegory of the human condition in the backdrop of Swadeshi movement. Demla represents the confused and displaced human torn between the choice of idealism and empiricism, symbolized by Nikhil and Sandeep respectively. The novel is a prototype of the life of Tagore, torn between being a national gem along with a world-renowned author. This paper aims... hello, is the voice clear?
There is a disturbing sound in the background. I don't know what sound it is, but could you be a little louder? Could you bring the microphone a little closer to your mouth while speaking?
Is it better now?
Much better, much better.
Okay, thank you. This paper aims to focus on the universal human dilemma of finding resolution between the home, personal, secure, defined, and the world that is political, expensive, and unpredictable. Further, it will stretch out this quandary to the practice of translation, as the novel was translated by the author's nephew, Rabindranath Tagore, in English in 1919, with suggestions from the author. The goal is to analyze the issues that problematize the harmonious union of the patriotism and the cosmopolitanism, and how a translated text in itself speaks for this concern. In the novel, Nikhil is considered to have been created by Tagore in his own image. He is the mouthpiece to voice out the idealism of freedom as being separated from the nationalistic desire to be just being physically free from the dictatorship of the colonizer. Thus, Tagore did not associate the concept of liberation as being just limited to a particular nation's boundary, but the feeling that liberates from the boundaries itself. Therefore, English did not appear to Tagore as a colonizer's language, but a tool through which he could achieve universal liberation. Although he also kept on writing in Bengali to stick to his roots and feel a deep sense of connection with his close community. In the novel too, Nikhil does not see his patriotism as being associated with developing a hatred for the others, such as Muslims, Dalits, or poor peasants. He seeks for a cosmopolitan approach to freedom, where a human's free spirit holds more value over just having physical freedom. Thus, along with doing his own share for freedom struggle of India, Nikhil also provides shelter to minority and poor communities. In the same manner, though Tagore continued to write in Bengali his whole life, he equally gave importance to his English compositions and translations to reach a larger audience and to connect to a global community under one roof. On the contrary, we have Sandeep's character in the novel, whose love for his country is embodied in employing violence on the other without paying any heed to the humane aspect of the equation. His brutal perspective towards the idea of freedom involves blindly hating everything that belongs to the colonizer and neglecting the positive aspect of the situation. He is merciless in his liberation endeavors and pays no attention to the voice of his soul, a point stressed by Nikhil during an argument session with Sandeep, and I quote, "Winning your kind of success is success gained at the cost of the soul, but the soul is greater than success," unquote. Consequently, Nikhil and Sandeep stand at two polar ends, both pitting against each other to establish their supremacy in ideology of freedom. They are also symbolic of the quandary that every human faces between choosing the two worldviews, where one generally relates to national and other relates to international issues. The conflict of being a citizen of a nation and the citizen of the world is presented vividly by Tagore in the novel, a confusion that he also himself experienced in his life while living both as a reputed national poet and an internationally acclaimed Nobel laureate. The third character of the novel is quintessential to the narrative of the novel and puts into limelight the conflicting atmosphere of the plot. Nikhil's wife Bimla is a typical Hindu household girl who loves her fairy tale life in the earlier part of the novel. But as the story progresses, she finds herself being taken in by the zealous charm of Sandeep and renounces her past position to become a queen bee and supports the latter's destructive nationalistic fervor. The novel is also regarded as a tragedy, and in fact, it is the tragedy symbolizing the predicament of human in finding a perfect balance between the self and the other. In fact, Bimla is introduced to Sandeep by Nikhil himself to help her break the traditional norms defined for a woman of 20th century India and to enter in a world of confidence. But Bimla gets sucked into the jingoistic passion of Sandeep and in turn starts to associate herself with Mother India. She becomes a molded idol to be defined by people like Sandeep, a thing that Nikhil was trying to take her away from. As for him, her orderliness is what adds to her liberation. Nikhil does not amalgamate religion and patriotism like Sandeep, as he knows it brings up partisan views which ultimately result in carnage. And I quote, "I am willing to serve my country, but my worship I reserve for right, which is far greater than my country. To worship my country as a god is to bring a curse upon it." Unquote. The novel takes a prominent turn when Bimla's surrogate son, Amulya, dies in Hindu-Muslim riots. This shift makes Bimla realize the poisonous effect of militant patriotism. This incident echoes the effect the 1919 Amrit Sen massacre had on the psyche of Tagore, which resulted in him renouncing his knighthood to protest against this terrible Holocaust. Year 1919 also becomes significant for the fact that this was the year when the English translated version of The Home and the World was published, with translation done by the author's nephew, Surendranath Tagore. At this juncture, Tagore found himself struggling between his national and cosmopolitan selves, and his resigning from knighthood was his universal declaration that accepting English as a means of delivering his ideas to a worldwide audience does not mean accepting the cruelty of the British regime. Mulkraj Anand called Rabindranath Tagore the first self-conscious novelist in India who handled fiction with a deep awareness of its essential opposition to dogma or doctrinaire belief. The characters of the novel are judicially casted by Tagore to represent the different ideologies prevailing in the backdrop of the Swadeshi movement, with each one of them representing unique mindsets belonging to various sections of the society in the colonized India. The debate between Nikhil and Sandeep is a microcosm of the clashes happening at major level in their bloodiest forms. Bimla is the central ground, representing the Mother India herself, defined by militant nationalists as having a fixed image, which Nikhil rather prefers to see just as an ordinary human being who has equal compassion towards other humans, irrespective of their religion, gender, caste, creed, or color. Ashish Nandi puts it correctly. Bimla's identification with the country becomes a literal one. The destruction of her home and her world foreshadows the destruction of the society. Thus, the personal tragedy of Bimla is a premonition to the gruesome incidents of the partition that the whole country underwent. In a letter written in 1908, Rabindranath Tagore penned down the brutal consequences of destructive patriotism. And I quote, "Patriotism cannot be our final spiritual shelter. My refuge is humanity. I will not buy glass for the price of diamonds, and I will never allow patriotism to triumph over humanity as long as I live." And I unquote. Hence, Tagore makes a defining line separating militant nationalism and humane patriotism. His views highlighting the horrible effects of destructive nationalism are put effectively in the autobiographical novel The Home and the World. Along with throwing light on the quandary of patriotism and cosmopolitanism, the translation of the novel puts to the forefront the ideology that imbibing colonizers' language does not mean giving a nod to the cruel regime. Tagore's self-conscious approach to the judicious use of English language and his cosmopolitan ideas shows that providing an international and civilized platform to your ideas does not mean leaving your roots. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We would now move on to our first speaker for the day. We are taking the questions at the end of the session, Santana. You would have to be with us for the questions. So we move on to Dr. Animesh Roy. Animesh Roy is an assistant professor in Xavier's College, Jharkhand. Over to you, Dr. Roy.
Thank you, Monica Kili. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are perfectly audible, sir.
Okay, fine. Good morning, everyone. The title of my paper for today is The Home in the World, Literature, Culture and Tagore's Ecovision. And for today, I'll be focusing precisely on Tagore's essays, conversations and letters. Okay. I don't believe that the ecovision that we discover from these essays, conversations and letters are holistic, but it will serve to a large extent to understand, at least in brief, about how Tagore thought about ecology and eco-consciousness at a time when it was not that much at the limelight. So here goes my paper. Literary investigations about the Anthropocene was urged out of a desire to explore how anthropogenic changes as a result of humans' presumed superiority over the rest of creation has led to contemporary ecological morass, and how literature might serve as a mediating tool in disseminating ecological wisdom and relevance. Writing much earlier to the emergence of modern environmental movement in the West and subsequently in India, Tagore could be regarded as the precursor to the modern ecological thinking in India. Long before the dangers of climate change and global warming became rallying points for environmentalists and ecologists, Rabindranath was consciously practicing and promulgating methods, the theories and practice of which would go on to become a benchmark for a self-sustaining society which lives in harmony with its environment. It can be argued further that Tagore's innate empiricism, as a result of his growing awareness, anticipated the environmental discourse that would lead eventually to the World Conservation Strategy published by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in 1980 and followed by the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, in 1987. Unlike a few of his Western predecessors, especially the American transcendentalists, Tagore's eco-philosophies, instead of being reductionist, were much more universal, that not only embraced the eco-philosophy of organic unity inherent in Indian culture, but also were accommodative of the much more recent and often larger environmental threats to the art because of socio-political and cultural changes resulting from colonialism. Amitav Ghosh, in his very recent book, The Great Derangement, might have accused the writers of their complicity of the ecological crisis for their imaginative failure to deal with the cultural crisis. But this paper, delving on select prose works of Tagore, would seek to prove how Tagore was not only critical of the environmental crisis because of the anthropogenic changes, but how he anticipates much of the reasons behind the environmental problems of today, be it capitalism, overconsumption, industrialization, social justice, and even biopolitics. Tagore's eco-philosophical ideas about nature and ecology is intimately connected with his religion. In The Living Voice in India and Freedom, he confesses that he was brought up in the atmosphere of religious mysticism. His father was a great admirer of the Upanishads and the Sufi mystics, and thereby, quite unconsciously, he shaped his philosophical thoughts and his life on the philosophical teachings in the Upanishads. As he himself acknowledged the truth from the Upanishads, to quote, "Only he knows truth who realizes himself in all beings and all others in himself," unquote. Quite naturally, Tagore recognizes all material manifestations are a shadow of the spiritual divinity prevailing within all of the creations of the earth, and thereby it is essential to recognize the manifestations of the Creator in different forms and to live in harmony with each other. Such an eco-spiritual vision is in stark contrast to the biblical narrative, which gives man the centrality and authority over the rest of God's creation. Interestingly, many of Tagore's predecessors in America, such as Thoreau, in which there's a Prose book, Walden, where he points out that in wilderness is the preservation of the world. And John Muir, being influenced by certain Eastern religions and rejecting the reductionist, destructive, and dualistic worldview of the West, professed the need for nature preservation. Their radical approach ended up in promoting a nature protection campaign, which was essentially xenophobic, that treated man not as part of nature, but as an outsider to it. It was John Muir, the foremost representative of the philosophy of nature preservation, and who may very well be dubbed as the spiritual guru behind the international national park movement, who influenced the German botanist Dietrich Brandes, who pioneered the setting up of the Forest Department in India, an institution that has been at the center for the man-animal conflicts in India. But Tagore, recognizing the essential intertwining of relationships between nature and culture and rejecting the nature-culture dichotomy, sees humans as part of nature and not as an outsider. In his essay, The Religion of the Forest, Tagore argues how the ideal of perfection preached by the forest dwellers of ancient India runs through the heart of India's classical literature and still dominates people's minds. The forests are sources of life, and they are the storehouse of biodiversity. The biodiversity of the forest teaches lessons of democracy, of leaving space for others while drawing sustenance from the common wave of life. Again, in his essay Topobon, Tagore writes, Indian civilization has been distinctive in locating its source of regeneration, material and intellectual, in the forest, not the city. India's best ideas have come when man was in communion with trees and rivers and lakes, away from the crowds. The peace of the forest has helped the intellectual evolution of man. The culture of the forest has fueled culture of Indian society. The culture that has arisen out from the forest has been influenced by the diverse process of renewal of life, which are always at play in the forest, varying from species to species, from season to season, in sight and sound and smell. The unification principle of life in diversity of democratic pluralism thus becomes the principle of Indian civilization. In contrast to the country-city binary of the West, in which the city symbolizes corruption and country is the symbol of purity, almost as a sort of locus eminus, a desire toward a pre-lapsarian perfect world, Tagore essentially conceives of the relationship between village and the city to that of perfect rhythm, harmony, and reciprocity. In his essays, City and Village and the Robbery of the Soil, he explains how the mutual benefit between the city and the village remains strong only so long as the spirit of cooperation and self-sacrifice remains a living ideal. Tagore sees cities as having a special function in maintaining wealth and knowledge in concentrated forms of opulence, but which should not be for its own exclusive sake. They should not magnify themselves. They should enrich the entire society. Tagore's idea of the village is intimately connected to the eco-feminine idea of Prakriti, the living force that supports life. Villages are like women. In their keep is the cradle of the race. They are nearer to nature than the towns, and therefore in close touch with the fountain of life. They have the atmosphere of a natural power of healing and regeneration. Like women, they provide people with the elemental need, with the food and joy, with the simple poetry of life, and with those ceremonies of beauty which the village spontaneously produces and in which she finds delight. But when constant strain is put upon her through the extortionate claims of ambition, when her resources are exploited through the excessive stimulus of temptation, then she becomes poor in life. From her time-honored position of the wedded partner of the city, she is degraded to that of a poor servant. This eco-philosophy of coexistence gave Tagore the impetus to the Sriniketan experiment of rural reconstruction, which would become a benchmark for a self-sustaining society which lives in harmony with its environment. Much earlier to Donna Haraway's popularizing of the term capitalism, Tagore explored how unchecked capitalism not only leads to pockets of unequal development, but also led to the ill effects of industrialization, plantation, and greed in India and elsewhere. Thus, moving away from the ecosophical ideas, Tagore's ideas of the environment are often post-colonial, as he challenges the Western notion of the development, progress, and industrialization. Referring to the different socio-political, cultural, and economic realities of India, Tagore in his essay East is West and the Problem in India suggests that each people has its physical environment given to it and social surroundings created by itself. Its history is its continual adjustments to this, though modification of inner and outer world, and the conditions which have prevailed in India from a remote antiquity have guided its history along a particular channel and cannot coincide with the lines of evolution taken by other countries under different sets of influences. It would be a sad misreading of the lessons of the past to apply our energies to trade too closely in the footsteps of any other nation, however successful in its own career. In his essay, The Construction versus Creation, as Tagore reflects on his journey from Calcutta to Japan, he recollects with shock and a sense of personal injury not only the sites of the ruthless intrusion of factories on both the banks of the Ganges, where they were mostly unbecoming in their brazen-faced effrontery, but also later on his noticing of the oil spill in the sea. Through such brief anecdotes, Tagore was thus challenging the Western concept of economic production of profits and capital accumulation, with his own concept of economics as the production of sustenance and need satisfaction. Thus, Tagore's argument resonated with the principle of ecological socialism as propounded by Gandhi later on. Reflecting on the differences between the West and India, Tagore argues the civilization of the West has in it the spirit of machine, which must move, and to that blind movement, human lives are offered as fuel. Globalization has created a civilization that is based on power and greed and the spirit of machine worldwide. A civilization based on power and greed is a civilization based on violence. In the spirit of freedom, Tagore warned the people who have sacrificed their souls for the passion and profit-making and the drunkenness of power, constantly pursued by phantoms of panic and suspicion, and therefore they are ruthless. They become morally incapable of allowing freedom to others. Greed and accumulation must lead to slavery. He went on to observe, my experience in the West, where I have realized the immense power of money and organized propaganda, walking everywhere behind screens of camouflage, creating an atmosphere of distrust, timidity, and antipathy, has impressed me deeply with the truth the real freedom is of the mind and spirit. It can never come to us from outside. He only has freedom who ideally loves freedom himself and is glad to extend it to others. He who distrusts freedom in others loses his moral right to do so. Reflecting on overconsumption and greed, Tagore argues in The Robbery of the Soil that the search for wealth, which is the synonym for production and collection of things, can make use of men ruthlessly and crush life out of the earth. Civilization today caters for a whole population of gluttons, and intemperance, which could safely be tolerated in a few, has spread its contagion to the multitude. A civilization which has attained such an unnatural appetite must, for its continuing existence, depend upon numberless victims. These are being sought in those parts of the world where human flesh is cheap. In Asia and Africa, a bartering goes on through which the future hope and happiness of entire people is sold for the sake of providing some fastidious fashion with an endless supply of respectable rubbish. Now, Rachel Carson's Fable for Tomorrow in Silent Spring, raising the concern about how once harmonious American landscape suddenly blighted by some mysterious malady that has brought devastation to an entire community, may have led to the foundation of modern environmentalism. But Tagore, in his Robbery of the Soil, explains the interdependence even of all life forms, even the microbial. He points out how insects, in spite of their robbery of the soil, leaves a surplus of nourishments for the tillers of the soil and how exploitation of the soil gradually exhausts the soil of life, the soil which needs constant replenishing by the return of life to it through the completion of the cycle of receiving and giving back. Again, Tagore looks at how technological intervention has impacted not only the ecoscapes of the region, but also the basic health and nourishment of its people. In the essay, The Rice We Eat, Tagore reflects on how the rice mills not only deprived the population of the country of basic nourishment, but it created an unholy alliances with malaria and other flag bearers of death, robbing the whole people of its vitality through a constant weakening of its nourishments. Thus, at a time when most thinkers were concerned with an aesthetic appreciation of nature, Tagore moved towards a post-grain consciousness. Tagore's eco-consciousness thereby stems from a distinct sense of eco-cosmopolitanism, a transnational way of approaching environmental eco-discourses. It attempts to address the intellectual challenge of drawing on the strength of bioregionalism without succumbing to eco-parochialism by moving toward a transnational ethics of place, a battle cry in modern environmental activism and literary environmentalism, of focusing on both the local as well as the global at the same time. Such an eco-consciousness is as much focused on the green and organic consciousness of ecology as it tries to bridge eco-discourses on both the brown and green landscapes, the Western and the post-colonial, with equal ease. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy, for that paper. Very enlightening. Thank you. You will have to wait for the questions till the end, and we have the next paper presenter with us, Medha Bhadra Chaudhary, Assistant Professor, St. Xavier's University, Kolkata. Over to you, Medha.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Thank you, Munikinki, and the Department of English SNU for this opportunity. In terms of the scope of this webinar and its focus on translation, I would like to mention that I have read the novel Rajarshi not through a linguistic-oriented approach to translation, but as a transposition of value or meaning, attempting to accommodate the present national crisis in Tagore's discourse on religion and statehood. My paper is on Tagore's novel Rajarshi and the anxieties of religion and politics that emerges through this text. Now, couched in the idiom of a historical narrative, Rabindranath Tagore's Rajarshi addresses the tensions associated with the rights of kingship and the intolerance of a dominant religious ideology. Now, while maintaining the contours of the historical novel, Tagore constantly examines alternative systems of religion and power, drawing upon the learning of the Upanishads to define his view of Hindu philosophy and of the ideal community. Now, although lesser known among the works of Tagore, this particular novel uncovers the politics of governance, which is complicated by Raja Gobindamaniku's decision to abolish human and animal sacrifice in his kingdom. Gobindamaniku, the king of Tripura, finds himself confronted with the question, why is there so much blood from the innocent tongue of a young girl, Hashi, as they proceed to the river for his daily ablution. The stream of blood from the Bhuvaneshwari temple trickles down pristine marble steps to the river, where Hashi, alarmed at the sight of blood from animal sacrifice, bends over to wipe the blood stain with the end of her sari. Soon after, Hashi succumbs to a fever, tortuously muttering through the night, "Ma, why is there so much blood?" Hashi's death precipitates a moment of spiritual awakening for Gobindamaniku, who declares the sacrifice of any living being in his kingdom unlawful. Now, his idea of divine will and worship is perceived as a challenge to the delicate balance between sovereign power and religious authority in the state, and potentially destabilizing the order of hierarchy, which places the royal priest Raghupati as a supreme religious leader. Gobindamaniku explains to a perplexed Raghupati that Ma appeared to me in the form of a young girl. She told me that being a loving mother, she cannot see the bloodshed of her children. Now, for Raghupati, religion represents a universal grid of order, I quote, a code of conduct, and it remains a powerful anchor of meaning and connectedness. He suggests that the king's premature predictions about their spiritual dimension could jeopardize the health of the nation and upset the religious piety of the people. He subtly indicates the need to delineate sovereign authority and religious law, justifies that the invented traditions inculcate certain values, create a sense of solidarity, and thereby construct, I quote, a useful national consciousness. Finally, outraged by the king's obstinacy, Raghupati storms out of the court, reminding him that the king can usurp everything that belongs to the subject, but he should not dare usurp their religion. Now, it must be understood at the outset that the word religion in the ancient Indian context refers to the Sanskrit word dharma. But dharma does not necessarily translate as religion, since it does not identify with any form of ritualistic worship or practice. Dharma may be associated with duty or righteousness, or simply the right practice of leading one's life. Now, Tagore uses the word dharma frequently in his lectures and writings and elaborates on the idea in Sadhana, where he writes that dharma is the innermost nature, the essence, the implicit truth of all things. Dharma is the ultimate purpose that is working in ourselves. Now, Tagore described dharma as a way of life, as a self-fulfilling force which operates within the sentient human being. Tagore also emphasized on the need for darshan or vision in the pursuit of dharma, and accepted that the pathway to the ultimate goal can differ from one person to the other. However, dharma cannot be separated from spirituality. The communion with the divine can only be achieved through the spirit. So dharma is not necessarily bound within the religious doctrine or the system of practices which it prescribes. In fact, the non-conformity of dharma with established practice may often lead to the belief that it is at odds with institutional religion. And the distinction is complicated because religion cannot simply be reduced to an expression of the inner self or an inclination towards God. In the conventional moorings of religion, while attempting to lead the individual to a spiritual ideal, are often related to a set of regulatory practices that govern everyday life and may not always unfold the freedom of pursuing one's essential belief. And Raja Gobindamanika argues that the religious law cannot be trusted to provide the absolute truth. Nobody can follow the scriptures adequately. Everybody interprets it according to their nature. The king's dharma is inextricably mingled with religion and politics. And the common consciousness that the king's power is that of God is undercut by Tagore's assertion of the universality of the duty of obedience. Now, the king assumes a divine status through obedience to the moral or natural laws of God. And Gobindamanika claims that the assimilation of sovereign power with the universal law of God creates the mystical personality of the king. Tagore transforms the image of the king's divinity to give him a more enduring source of strength. It is through the renunciation of his divine right of kingship that the Raja becomes a rishi. And Gobindamanika chooses a life of self-exile and decides to retreat to the forest. Now, Tagore writes in The Religion of Man, I quote, "Man in his detachment has realized himself in a wider and deeper relationship with the universe. In his spiritual life, his sense of union and the will which is free has its culmination in love. In the freedom of consciousness, he realizes the sense of his unity with the larger being, finding fulfillment in the dedicated life of an ever-progressive truth and an ever-active love." Now, released from the finite possibilities of kingship, Gobindamanika is led to the realization of supreme reality, the manifestation of the larger being, which Tagore mentions. And this makes him, I quote, "the true Hindu Raja or king." Now, the Upanishadic sort of seer or rishi was inspired by the aim of understanding the nature of ultimate reality, and which they believed stood sort of behind the mundane world of ordinary experience. Further, the Upanishadic doctrine recognizes the presence of the world soul or supreme power, also called the Brahman. By opening his soul or Atma to nature, Gobindamanika perceives a sense of oneness with the universal soul, the infinite, which is present in all beings. The realization of the infinite or Advaitam may be understood as a positive aspect of the spiritual union. And again, Tagore observes in The Religion of Man that Advaitam or absolute unity relies upon the comprehension of multitude, not as in an outer receptacle, but as in an inner perfection that permeates and exceeds its contents, like the beauty in a lotus, which is ineffably more than all the constituents of the flower. Raghupati, in contrast, regards the king's dharma as a conscious form of dishonesty. By ignoring his sovereign function of protecting the religious custom of the land and the religious principle behind Hindu sacrifice, Gobindamanika commits the offense of tyranny. The ideal state, according to Raghupati, has in praxis two sources of power, the temporal and the spiritual, working in harmony for the maintenance of peace and the ordered conduct of life among Hindus. By denying sacrifice to the goddess, Gobindamanika violates this dualistic structure of governance and minimizes the prerogative of the temple. He is seen as establishing his own claim to power. And this condition of coordinate authority into diverse and ill-defined spheres cannot be one of lasting duration. And inevitably, it is found that the desire for power, coupled with the sense of this appropriation of power, is something that sort of leads to this inequality and sort of the absolute supremacy of one order over the other. Raghupati's dharma finds expression in the dynamism of ritual. The conventional idea of God is realized at a metaphysical level instead of the level of your human value system. And creed or faith is figuratively cast in the body of the deity instead of its symbolism. Therefore, sacrifice becomes a part of the preparatory movement, disciplining, purifying, and giving meaning to his religious purpose. And he invokes the divine sanction for sacrifice as a single trenchant formula towards Hindu worship, unwilling to accept a variety of religious experience. Now, for Tagore, Hinduism was a perpetual process of reconciliation of contradiction, a constant adjustment of opposites in a peaceful, harmonious way. So this creative ideal of dharma gives place to an overwhelming passion and bigotry for Raghupati, who refuses to sort of bend his monistic ideology and presents an interesting counterpoint to Tagore's view of Hinduism. So far, the paper has focused on the formulaic opposition between religion and sovereign power, which appears to be at the core of the novel. And also it has dwelt on the philosophy of the Upanishads in order to construct the figure of the ideal man or Rajoshi. However, Tagore's idea about religion and politics can also be read in terms of the social institutions and the political issues to which Tagore gives serious thought in his writings, and it may as well be extended to the present context of Indian culture with its growing religious and national tensions. In Rajoshi, Tagore focused on what he called, I quote, the freedom of social relationship, which one attains by accepting responsibility for one's community and, in effect, to humanity at large. Tagore had understood the dangers of religious fanaticism in India, since he knew that the absence of religious knowledge and doctrinal education would impede the creation of secular value, and the liberal ideology of the West was effective in fulfilling its objective of transmitting knowledge in objective learning, which was capable of critiquing both religious codes and the interventions of the state in matters pertaining to religion. In India, as Tagore saw it, faith becomes a pawn in the hands of the elite and the religious order, who seek to interpret religion according to their own necessity. And thus it becomes sort of inimical to communal harmony. Although, certainly Tagore was writing of this in terms of the colonial legacy of divide and rule in the context of the communal discord and radicalism in the country in 1941. But his words from the crisis of civilization may be aptly administered to the present condition of state-controlled religious dogmatism in our country. And Tagore writes in The Crisis of Civilization, the greatest misfortune that has now confronted India is not only the unfortunate lack of food, cloth, and education, but is more crucially the barbarous inner discord among Indians, which has no parallel. The danger is that our society is held responsible for it, but the misfortune is gradually becoming so severe day by day that such a dehumanized and uncivilized consequence of Indian history would never happen if it were not nourished by the indulgence from a secret corner of government machinery. In the context of the current wave of Hindu radicalism or saffronization, where we find it results in several common patterns, which are concerning for both policymakers and development partners. These words of Tagore ring true. In some cases, the state is incapable of generating cohesion among people of different faiths to maintain peace and stability. In other cases, the state is complicit in supporting radicalization by curbing political rights, pluralism, and civil liberties. Nonetheless, the present problems seem to stem from different interpretations of religion and religious religious freedom by the people in the state. The rise of a Hindu hyper-nationalism indicates a specific religious attitude sweeping over the country. And this radical religious ideology threatens to undermine the pluralist, democratic, socio-political fabric of the country, and it becomes even more dangerous when supported by the state machinery, the secret corner of government machinery, as Tagore would say. So the idea of a Hindu India, which finds expression through various media and social platforms, depends upon a majoritarian view of religion, and the assumption of a rising religious threat to the Hindu population. So therefore, to read, Rajoshi against the grain of the rising Hindu nationalist sentiment at present reveals the pitfalls of using Hinduism as a divisive religious model, where the word Hindu implies not only certain religious beliefs, but also a certain nationality and almost necessarily a certain social organization. And the idea of being Hindu or of Hinduism continues to be problematic. And issues of identity or self-definition in an increasingly complex and multi-layered society remains unfortunately dependent on religion. Tagore's reflections on the extremities of Hindu religious thought and its accompanying anxieties throughout the novel, and indeed in many of his literary works, are worthy of attention in contemporary India, with its tendency to present Hinduism as an ancient and unchanging tradition, neglecting in the process the need to reformulate Hinduism in response to the present religious dilemmas of the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Medha, for that lovely paper of yours. We now move on to the next speaker. As we know that we are taking the questions at the end of the session, and I have heard that Medha has some professional commitments today. So Medha, in case you have questions, we are going to email them to you in case you are not there with us till the end, or if you can finish up your classes and then come back and join us again. Okay, on that note,
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Medha. We have our next speaker, Dr. Debballo Chatterjee, lecturer in English, Kobi Shukanto Mohavidyalaya, Hooghly. Over to you, Dr. Chatterjee. Dr. Chatterjee, your microphone is on mute. Could you please unmute it?
Yeah, is it audible now?
Yes,
it is audible.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Professor Shubhit. Good afternoon, sir, Professor Amrit Sen, and all of my friends over here. Now, my paper is on local habitation and the theme, Eurocentrism versus Indianism in the ghost stories of Rabindranath Tagore. Now, first we look at how the European theories on Gothic literature have actually problematized the issue, have discussed the issue, have populated the Gothic fiction, the Gothic culture. So I'll read this like this. The inception of European Gothic fiction took place only when Boris Walpole published his work, The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story, in the year 1764. Before this time, Gothic had no serious literary exposure, as it was long suppressed under the dominance of rationality in the 18th century period. Now, Gothic is predominantly a part of the irrational that emerged through a reaction against the dominant forms of order and reason. Side by side, sharing the shades of irrationality, Gothic developed a dichotomous and conflicted relationship with rationality and unshackled restriction laid down by order and logic. Against the 18th century notions of sublimity, particularly regarding the nature of perfection and aesthetic, which were positivistic in their exposition, Gothic actually opted a contrapuntal way. Now, two key elements which are common in all forms of Gothic fiction and Gothic particularly, are Taylor and Poe, that determine the intensity of horror. Now, Gothic horrors enchanted many major theorists of different ages, and some of them might be quoted here. For our discussion, I have taken up Edmund Burke, J. Lykin, and Sigmund Freud. Now, we will refer to Edmund Burke and read what he has said in the book a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas and the sublime and beautiful. Now, Burke says that in the chapter entitled Of the Sublime, that, I quote, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, or inconversant about terrible objects, or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is a source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion. Now, pain actually operates one top of the other, because pain actually creates a sensation, a more exciting kind of emotion within us that actually leads us on to the next level. According to Burke, terror leading to torment, pain, and suffering, both physical and psychological, has a much greater effect on us than any kind of pleasure. Pain is as much stronger operative in this case than pleasure, and the sensation of pain as an appreciation of its intensity guides us onto a sensational level of terror. Again, further to this notion of terror, as Burke argues superlatively, there is nothing like fear to achieve an active control over our psyche. The reason for this, as Burke states, fear being an apprehension of pain or death, it operates in a manner that resembles actual pain. Indeed, terror is in all cases whatsoever either more openly or latently the ruling principle of the sublime. Now, Burke had said many things in his book. For the limited period of time, for the limitation of time, I will just skip some points and I move on to Aikin. So Aikin says that the pain of suspense and the irresistible desire of satisfying curiosity, when once raised, will account for our eagerness to go quite through an adventure, though we choose pain during the whole of it. We rather choose to suffer the smart pang of a violent emotion than the uneasy craving of an unsatisfied desire. So we never get tired once we get the pleasure of pain. So in Gothic fiction, what is available to us, what is enchanting for us, what is magical for us, is the intensity of pain, is the intensity of horror that actually excites us, that actually enchants us, and that makes Gothic so attractive. Now, I've said that I refer to Freud. The Freudian uncanny is very important for us, for the discussion of the thing that I was talking about. So Freudian and uncanny, we all know about that. It's about finding the very magical in the very ordinary. So finding the very unusual in the very ordinary, what Freud talks about in the chapter called Uncanny, to shorten it. But these are all the European theories that we are talking about right now. Now I move on to Rabindranath Tagore. What Rabindranath Tagore uses specifically to create a more Indian variety of horror. Now, these three theorists have set up a major theoretical background and strengthened the backbone of European Gothic literature. We know that. Now, So, but these three theories have set up a major theoretical background and strengthened the backbone of European Gothic literature. The Indian ghost stories are palimpsests of European ghost stories. The European short stories on ghosts have set up a pattern which the non-Europeans try to adapt and adapt. This process of conscious literary and cultural activity is called post-colonial ghosting, that is common amongst non-European indigenous writing. Now, the non-Europeans try to maintain their indigenous identity by creating a local habitation and a name, and with this, they try to ward off the European hegemony from their texts. Thus, the post-colonial identity is maintained by a sustenance of literary resistance that is reflected in non-European literature. For our discussion on the topic mentioned above, as we have seen the title, we will look at the ghost stories of Rabindranath Tagore and the famous translations of Tagore's short stories by William Radice in the collection entitled Rabindranath Tagore Selected Short Stories. The famous ghost stories of Rabindranath Tagore, those of which will be discussed in this research article, are Kamkal, Jibito o Mrito, Udito Pashan, and Monihara. Now, Tagore actually utilizes the tool, the Indian aesthetic tool, the Bhayankara Rasa or the Bhayanaka Rasa in his texts. So, now, in order to see what the Bhayankara Rasa is or the Bhayanaka Rasa is, we have to look at, we have to read what Bharata Muni says in Natya Sastra chapter 6 about the Bhayanaka Rasa. Bharata Muni says that, now the terrible Bhayanaka sentiment has its basis the dominant state of fear. This is created by determinants like hideous noise, sight of ghosts, panic and anxiety due to untimely cry of jackals and owls, staying in an empty house or forest, sight of death or captivity of dear ones or news of it or discussion about it. It is to be represented on the stage by consequence such as trembling of hands and the feet, horripilation, change of color and loss of voice. Its transitory states are paralysis, perspiration, choking voice, horripilation, trembling, loss of voice, change of color, fear, stupefaction, dejection, agitation, restlessness, inactivity, fear, epilepsy, and death, and the like. The short story Kankal, which is translated as skeleton, which was published in the year 1892, is the first of the ghost stories written by Tagore. The story of Kankal describes a conversation between a medical student and an apparition. The skeleton of the apparition hangs on the wall of the room in which the apothecary is residing in. Time becomes a crucial factor in creating the atmosphere of the supernatural, and Tagore's mastery over this is reflected in the story well. The dialogue between the once medical student and the apparition starts at late hours of the night when the charcoal makes an unpleasant sound, intensifying the eerie atmosphere. The oil lamp becomes a catalyst between life and death, with the connections with day and night. The extinguishing of the lamp reminds one of us death and darkness, when all evil thoughts come into the psyche of an individual. The apothecary was reminiscing about the skeleton on which he made many experiments when suddenly he guessed that something living was gasping fast and moving here and there searching for something. The breadth of that living object gradually reached close to the mosquito net in which the human was lying, and there was a question, Ami. আমার সেই কঙ্কালটা কোথায় গেছে তাই খুঁজিতে আসিয়াছি. So the translation is like,
we can't hear Debmallo, Dr. Chatterjee, unfortunately. Can others hear him?
No, I think there is a problem with the connection.
Oh dear. Can somebody maybe inform him via WhatsApp or chat that he can't be heard? Perhaps he's reading on.
We do not have his number. I don't know who has his number.
Maybe, sir. Sir? Sir?
I'll try to get him.
Yeah, because he got cut off, sir. Got cut off at such an interesting point.
Exactly. Network issues are absolutely so disgusting today. I mean, I think he has understood that there is a problem. He's rejoining for us.
Network is in a mess today.
Absolute mess.
Yes, there was a power cut. But
Okay.
it's online.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Network, power, everything seems to be failing us today.
Absolutely.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, sorry, there was a power cut. My Wi-Fi connection was.
That's a ghost.
Right, okay. So, what I was saying that, আমি আমার সেই কঙ্কালটা কোথায় গেছে তাই খুঁজিতে আসিছি, and it is translated as me, I have come to see where my skeleton might have gone. Now, I will quote a portion from the text. The apparition says that, never seen me? Why? You saw my skeleton, but I must not tease you. How can I prove to you? How can I prove to you that in those empty eye sockets there were big, wide black eyes? That the skeleton's hideous toothy green bore no comparison with the sweet smile that played on my red lips. It would be both amusing and annoying to describe to you the grace, the youth, the firm, unblemished fullness that ripened day by day on those dry pieces of bone. The anatomy of that body of mine was beyond even the greatest doctors. Indeed, a doctor once said to his best friend that I was a golden lotus, meaning that anatomy and physiology could be learned from any other human body, but I was unique, a miraculous flower. Now, Tagore has utilized Bhayanaka Rasa in this text. At the same time, he has also utilized the Singara Rasa in order to give it an erotic flavor. The short story Kankal is a blend of the erotic and the horrific, which makes it very, very Indian. The apparition in the story uses a mock argumentative tone that problematizes the binary between humans and supernaturals that we find in European texts. Now, the supernatural in this story gives an elaborate description of its once beautiful woman body that was desired by men and how she used to tease young men of her time. In the same way, the ghost teases the young man with a description of her once beautiful physique and challenges that the young man will become crazy by listening to the descriptions of her qualities. Right? Now, the next story is Jivitamrito, that is translated as the living and the dead. It is a great example about our conceptions and misconceptions about supernaturalism. Now, the key person, the key woman in this story is Kadambini, who is actually a widow, and she looks after her brothers. She looks after the son of her brother-in-law, and the child loves her dearly, and Kadambini also loves the child too. But due to the illness of the child's mother, Kadambini had developed a kind of keen attachment with the child. Now, suddenly, one day, Kadambini's heartbeat stopped for some reason, and she was considered to be dead. All the cremation activities were arranged accordingly, and 4 people carried her to the cremation place, and her body was left in a hut beside a river. These 4 men were actually trying to gather wood to burn her body. In the meantime, Kadambini got back to life, and the key part of the story, the interesting part of the story, starts after this thing happened. The creation of an essentially Indian supernatural ambience is done with the sounds of cries of insects and amphibians. Just the steady murmur, I quote from the text, just a steady murmur of crickets and frogs around the camp, and the formations of clouds in an inky dark night with no stars and no source of light intensifies the situation more. Now, this might be an adaptation, this might be a parody of Shakespeare's Macbeth, because in Shakespeare's Macbeth, in Act 1 particularly, in Scene 2, we find, I read from the text, first which says, I come Grey-Malkin, second which says, Paddock, third which says Anon, all of them say, where is found and found is where water forgets in the air. Now, right, I will go to Pudito Pashan. Pudito Pashan is, you all know, it is translated by Amitabh Ghosh also, and it is found in the collection entitled Rabindranath Tagore Short Stories, published by Oxford University Press. So Pudito Pashan is a very nice story to discuss about the Bhayankara Rasa and the erotic sense of being, as well as the world wisdom propagated by or circulated by Rabindranath Tagore. The basic story is about a tax collector, his experience inside the Mahal built by Shah Muhammad II. And the Mahal is actually built on the structure of a European Gothic castle. But there are some buzzards, there are some hideous noises, and the nighttime experiences of the tax collector is very important for us in order to find a better meaning what Rabindranath Tagore says about the utilization of the Bhayankar Rasa. Now, why Tagore did this, I have charted some points. Tagore actually uses a contrapuntal discipline in his short story that actually removes the colonial shadows of European Gothic tradition. The canonical colonial structures and ideologies are deconstructed in order to create a more postmodern form of horror. The haunting of European ghosts, long entrenched in the horror stories, has been removed with a much more sophisticated form, like the Bhayankara.
I would kindly request Debmalo sir to kindly wrap up the paper. Actually, we have already covered 15 minutes, sir.
Right. Okay, right.
Can you please kindly conclude, sir? Thank you.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, sir.
Further to this, comic tropes, indigenous identity, and local variety of horror have successfully enriched the spectral ontology of Gothic literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. We would now move on. We are taking the questions at the end, as I've already told everyone. So, and now we move on to the next speaker, Monica Chaudhary, PhD research scholar, English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad. Monica,
hello. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Monica, you're audible.
Hello, everyone. My name is Monica, and I'm a PhD student at EFL University, Hyderabad. The title of my paper is The Transcendental Tagore, Reading Tagore from a Post-Nationalist Perspective. The mirage that national homogeneity fabricates in order to extract commitment from people is fatal to the existence of those who are largely ignored by this circumvented project.
It
is true that nationalism as a sentiment continues. It is true that nationalism as a sentiment continues to act as the binding agent in order to weld people together as a nationalist entity. Its rigid and codified boundaries limit the entry of the foreign, illegal, and extraterritorial elements branded as not suitable for inclusion. In this context, post-nationalism is one such recent development that enables us to conceptualize an alternative framework for reimagining borders and establishing collective solidarity. This paper argues that post-nationalism is one such approach devoted to the project of nation building, which has the potential to reclaim the political space, which is hijacked by the national entrepreneurs. By disrupting nationalist framings, it helps to get over the fetish or hegemony of nationalism. Its semi-permeable boundaries enable increasing fluidity, thus enlarging the scope for increasing membership and thereby puncturing the conventional membership regime proposed by nationalist discourses. For an inquiry into the same, I would make use of Rabindranath Tagore's Home and the World. I speculate that Tagore has been a silent proponent of post-nationalism through his writings. His emphasis on humanitarian principles and humane association, which extends beyond borders, is aimed at evolving towards a global society. Both through his fictional and non-fictional writings, he has argued to rise above exclusivity and provincialism to free the world from fetters of materialism, nationalism, and other such barriers. His works offer scope to re-articulate nationalism and politics beyond the parochialism of national boundaries. The dynamic world as represented in his novels abounds in possibilities and is always in a state of flux. I believe that Tagore implicitly urges to rise above the territorial parochialism and unite on a more inclusive platform. His disavowal of nationalism provides a scope to question the credibility of nationalism as a viable option for establishing collectivity amongst people. The present state of events in the country proves true his apprehensiveness. He could maybe perhaps fathom from the defining ideology of his time the need to find an alternative to strident parochial nationalism. It thus becomes essential to understand his engagement with nationalism and the limitations he foresaw in this concept. Tagore's evaluation of nationalism as visible from his works composed between 1904 to 1907 displays a sense of internal contradiction and ambivalence. It takes a form that is neither completely nationalistic nor multivalent. But especially with the partition of Bengal in 1905, when local upheavals became a common phenomenon not only in Bengal but also nationwide, we see that he becomes more disillusioned with nationalism as communal tensions begin to surface in the society, and he is able to discover an internal fracturing in the society, and he comes to critique his own political position. And his disenchantment with nationalism begins to grow gradually over the period of time. And we see that he is no longer a sympathizer of the political climate, and his critique of nationalism becomes more muscular as he begins to openly repudiate it. In his writings, this discomfort for nationalism is well articulated, especially in The Home of the World. He explicates the dangers of hyper-masculinity, hyper-patriotism, hypersexuality, and other such aggressive manifestations of emotions latent and readily available in Indian society. Home in the World is a successful expression of Tagore's examination of nationalism vis-a-vis his engagement with Indian tradition and culture. Especially through the character of Nikhilesh, he is able to depict that shift that comes about in his intellectual positioning from being a sympathizer of national activism to a critique of nationalism. And the text very well displays the inefficacy of militant Biplabhi ideology and belligerent forms of nationalism. For Tagore, nationalism is basically a European invention, and it is blindly replicated in India without even recognizing its needs and dangers. He believes that the concept of nationalism doesn't dovetail with Indian structural framework, whose central edifice is tradition and cultural values. So for a country as diverse as India to impose a homogeneous set of ideas, for him is very unfeasible. And in one of his other works, Gora, he very well expresses the dangers of homogenization in a diverse society. So nationalism for him is a mechanical pursuit that involves ignoring values which form the moral fabric of Indian society. So Tagore is completely conscious of the fact that the stakes are quite high, and there is a need to engage in a different sort of conversation that involves dialogue, listening, and understanding the other. There's one more character in the novel, the character of Sandeep, and through him, Tagore exposes the excessiveness of nationalist leaders and the manners in which they abuse the nationalist movement for their political advantages. Tagore knew that India's major problems are cultural and social, like caste system, and not political. So even if the country achieves freedom and caste system remains intact, it wouldn't make any sense. So it would be similar to installing another set of rulers with another hierarchical setup, replacing the former. So in this context, novel carefully charts the rise of agitation against the British colonial rule. We could see that there is a development of cultural of hatred, and politics of vengeance had acquired a hypnotic hold over the minds of people. Tagore could see that his apprehensions are not unwarranted for, and the blind imitation of an alien concept has brought disaster to the civilization. The successful display of the limitations of nationalism in the novel is an attempt to dissuade the country from joining the bandwagon of nationalism. Nationalism comes with its own disadvantages as it generates hatred, prejudice, irrationality amongst people. And what Tagore is espousing to is a more supranational, global, and transcendental entity, which would be followed by a more humanistic approach. So this approach for me is a classic example of post-nationalism. I believe that post-nationalism as a discourse emerged much later, but for me, Tagore had predicted its arrival way before. So in this context, post-nationalism is not to be seen as an antonym of nationalism, and nor does it strictly typify the end of nationalism. One could simply see it as an alternative method of fashioning the world. It is one approach that allows one to successfully mold the pattern of identification and usher change from within. So if you locate this discourse in a Tagorean universe, so this structure would comprise of set of values which would foster sensitization of humans, making them more humane and less driven by materialistic metaphors. So the aim is to go beyond the codified and parochial structures of nationalism and to identify with fellow humans on a more humane level. Now, one could argue that nationalism and post-nationalism might be similar, that they both have their own set of values and ideology, and they demand fidelities from people in order to function. But if you look at it from a Tagore's point of view, the essential difference is in the process or their approach towards the network of ethics in the society. When nationalism offers you less and less space for identification beyond borders, post-nationalism is liberal enough to transcend the territorial parochialism, and it is essentially the humanistic element which borders Tagore the most. So the post-nationalist aesthetic proposed by Tagore is one of the boldest intellectual leaps. In this, he is not only challenging the very notion of citizenship, he is also giving alternative ways of assembling this static notion. He sees that idea of citizenship turns people alien upon their own land, and Tagore's thesis resists any such kind of illegal personhood. Tagore is thinking of something far greater than the static idea of a nation, because nation coerces people to act against their own kind and for their own personal interest. If you see in the past orders, the transition from monarchy, oligarchy, dictatorship, and theocracies, this proves that looking for alternatives for the organization of a society has been a common practice since antiquity. So post-nationalism in this manner could as well be seen as a latest development of the same kind. A common attribute of the preceding orders is that they have been politically myopic and lacked the discursive range of encapsulating all within the same order. With each adaptation, there is an attempt to furnish a more inclusive platform wherein a more elaborate membership could be formed. So each order is aiming towards a more democratic and liberal framework which would give space and voice to all. We know that in a postmodern world, there is a desire for looking for extra solidarities and do away with essentialism of all kinds. So Tagore, in this tone, is asking for a rehabilitation of the entire nationalist setup so that as a nation, one could surpass the dangers of fixity. And when I say fixity, in this case, assuming nationalism as a fixed entity. I believe nationalism is not a constant, rather something which is constantly refashioning itself, something that is constantly renewing itself so that it comes with more power. Tagore is proposing a similar form of collectivity which is not divisive and desensitizing. It preserves the core of the Indian civilization or Samaj, of which Tagore is so fond of. So to conclude with, I would say post-nationalism would usher a moral adjustment of the whole world where people would be conjoined by spiritual engagement and not by dictates of the nation state. Tagore's world, as depicted in his novels, is a reflection of this turmoil between the public and the private, between the inner truth and the falsity outside at a more nuanced level. His world, in its inchoate form, promises a utopianism which is very appealing, but it is high time we ensure that this does not get reduced to sheer political amnesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, for your paper. We are taking the questions at the end of the session. We have the next speaker with us, Shoykot Chakraborty, MPhil scholar, Kazi Nazrul Islam University. Are you there? Shoykot Chakraborty, are you there? Okay. We are unable to connect to Professor Shoykot Chakraborty at the present moment. We have our next speaker, Dr. Prashanta Ghoshal, visiting faculty, Sister Nivedita University, as the next paper presenter.
Thank you, Monikinkini. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, Prashanta.
Thank you, everybody, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much. I'm coming straight to my paper. My paper here is about Bolshevik illusion and Rabindranath Tagore. It is speaking about how Tagore was illusioned about Russia, how from the very beginning he was not very fond of it, and towards the end he was gradually becoming fond of it. And to begin with my paper, I would say that Russia has always been a ground of controversy in the world of politics. And there, Tagore was, like the other Indians, very much understanding as well as misunderstanding this particular country and their ideologies. Now, in To begin with, I would say in Jivan Smriti, Tagore said that we often heard in our childhood that the threat of an invasion of India by Russia, the eternal poker or the British government was being talked about. Even Tagore had said that in his childhood, his mother used to casually threaten him with the names of the Russians, about which he had written his first letter to his own father. Therefore, the idea of quote-unquote Russians are coming was a common fear of not only for this child Rabindranath Tagore, but also the entire colonial subjects of India. Now, it may be mentioned that from the very beginning of the 19th century, especially the fourth decade, the rise of the Russians and the Russian influence in Central Asia led to a strong panic among the British in India as well. Now, Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather, Prince Rabindranath Tagore, was highly praised in Russia for his fight against the age-old blind superstition and the modern thinking. But he himself was also, towards the end, terrified of the Russians, as we find in the 1847 version of Putrika. Now he took the fear to such a level that he was almost becoming a laughingstock, as we find in the about the English propagated India, English propagated Russia. Rabindranath was literally very much engaged in spreading sort of rumors, which made him a laughingstock towards the end. Anyway, evidences of these sort of words were already there in entire India as well as Bengal, and many newspapers and magazines were although there in the Tagore family, who which contained many translations and beautiful translations of the Russian stories and novels, and they were highly praised as well. But in spite of that, a fear not only in Tagore but in the entire Tagore family was there about the Russians. Now, in the very first half of 19th century, many people of India, especially the intellectuals, also paid homage to the Russian emperor. However, in the second half of 19th century, the dictatorship and the tyranny of the Russian kings became so widespread that the Bengalis also started being afraid of them, and there was an obvious instigation from the British people as well. The Bengalis started parallelly being interested about the Narodnik movement, which was kind of a populist initiative to connect the rural classes of Russia and the Russian intelligentsia in the political context that would overthrow the Tsar's administration in the 19th century. Now, the translated stories of self-sacrifice of the revolutionary youths of Russia immediately before 1917 caused a great stir among the freedom fighters and nationalists of our country, which was definitely a reason of fear for the British government. In Bama Bodhini, another paper, in Bama Bodhini, there was a beautiful translated copy of the life of revolutionary Vera Filipova that got published, and the lives of two other revolutionaries who were called Ivan Ivanovich and Paul Petrovsky, who can be also considered as the role models of the enterprising nihilists. They were also published in one of the volumes of Sadhana by Dinendra Kumar Roy. Such a life story was also published in Bharati, in which Rabindranath got directly involved and in an article on Russian Revolution, and that was published a few years before October Revolution. In 1908, the translation of the life of Vera Sazonova, originally written by Leo Scott, an American journalist, was also translated in Provashi, edited by Ramananda Chattopadhyay. The story did not end narrating the biography of Vera, of course, because Ramananda continued taking materials from Leo Scott's detailings, and there we find that later on, Vera was captured in a military barrack in the town of Kronstadt and was murdered the next day, was shot dead the next day. So this sacrifice of Vera had a mixed feeling for Tagore. Now, Tagore, through his translation, found himself on the one hand very interested, on the other hand very doubtful about his role being played into this entire matter of the sacrifice of Vera. what is significant in this entire matter, to quote Ramananda, what we find here, I'm quoting in Bengali, there we find that Ramananda is criticizing Tagore for shortening a significant part of Veda's life, where he is saying, Shraddhaspal Srijukta, I'm just quoting, Shraddhaspal Srijukta Rabindranath Tagore, ei prabandher bahulyo angsho bad dia, ihake সংক্ষিপ্ত করিয়া দিয়েছেন. However, again, evidence of Rabindranath's interest in the very translation of the life of Vera may be again mentioned as a reason of why Tagore referred to Ramananda to write this entire life of Vera. There Tagore writes, এই প্রবন্ধের নায়িকার স্বদেশ প্রেমের আত্মোৎসর্গের আশ্চর্য বিবরণটি আমাদের নিষ্ঠা উদ্বেগের উপযোগী বলিয়াই ইহাকে আপনার কাছে পাঠাইতেছি. So Tagore was always oscillating between an acceptance and hesitation about Russian patriotism and their extremism. However, in the same year, Jyotirindra Tagore published another translated work called The Daily Script of an Exiled in another of the volumes of Bharati. Probably that is the place where Jyotirindranath for the first time mentioned Marx and his capital in Bengali literature. This must be remembered that all these are matters far before socialist revolution of 1917. However, another revolution had already taken place in the year 1905, which was suppressed by the government, and it's known in history as Bloody Sunday. Thus, the socialist revolution of October 1917, at one time, the mainstay of the mass liberation movement in our society in India, instilled in some quarters the Bolshevik fears as well. The fear of the Russians has long been muted, although, but the West's propaganda let it return as a Bolshevik ghost and started spreading its dread. The letter that Rabindranath Tagore wrote to his father as a child was definitely was although about a child's apprehension about his mother and his mother's fear about Russia, expressed the similar fears about the country in the minds of the colonial powers 2 decades later. And that also we find in another story being documented in another story called Kabuliwala, when we also find Kabuliwala came to Minnie's house and he would discuss the relationship between the Russians and the English and the frontier policy with Minnie's father. Although that's a beautiful story, very emotional story, but this is also found there if speculated. However, after returning from abroad in 1890, long before the Russian Socialist Revolution, when the poet spent time in the Shilaidahor Shajatpur region, he to look after the administrative work, since he was a zamindar, so to look after the administrative works of the zamindari, he became acquainted with the misery of the poor people there. And that is what that is where he also referred to in Chinnopatra, that we find in Chinnopatra, where he referred to this particular idea that Russians could have been a medium to liberate these people, where he says, I'm again quoting, আমার এই দরিদ্র চাষী প্রজাগুলোকে দেখলে আমার ভারী মায়া হয়, এরা যেন বিধাতার শিশু সন্তানের মতো নিরুপায়। সোশ্যালিস্টরা যে পৃথিবীময় ধন ভাগ করে দেয় সেটা সম্ভব কি অসম্ভব জানি না, তবে যদি একেবারেই অসম্ভব হয় তাহলে বিধির বিধান বড় নিষ্ঠুর। So somewhere Rabindranath Tagore was having kind of a soft perspective, having kind of a sympathetic perspective for the socialists. Now socialist thought since then stirred his mind. However, he left the responsibility of implementing it completely to the conscience of humankind, where he said, which he called Manusher Unnoto Angsho, the developed part of the human psyche. Although social inequality plagued him, he did not. Later on, we find so many evidences where he said that he did not find a solution among the Bolsheviks. That is why I always say, I'm saying that he always was oscillating between supporting and not supporting. Again, in Provashi, we find Tagore was saying that the Russians did not stop giving Poland a chance for peace and strength. Rather, they considered the demands of Finland as well. Even we also find that Tagore is saying about the Russian progressive perspective that, again I'm quoting, the রুশরা খুব দৃষ্টান্ত দেখাইতেছে, রাশিয়ার মিত্রদের সঙ্গে সম্রাটের সন্ধি একটা শর্ত ছিল যে যুদ্ধ জয়ের পর তুরস্কের রাজধানী কনস্টান্টিনোপল রাশিয়ার হস্তগত হইবে, কিন্তু নতুন রুশ গভর্নমেন্ট বলিয়াছেন যে তাহারা পরের দেশ দখল করিবার জন্য যুদ্ধ করিতেছেন না, এমনকি তাহারা কনস্টান্টিনোপলও চান না। So gradually we find Tagore was moving forward towards understanding the perspective of Russia. Although we find Tagore denying Russia many times to visit their country, and in spite of 1,000 invitations, and his surrounding also instigated him not to. Anyway, I'll come to that later. The next phase, that is the Bolshevik Revolution that took place a year after, could not be accepted widely by this class of intellectuals in our country. Not to be outdone 8 months after the October Revolution, more than a decade before the trip to Soviet Union, Rabindranath wrote about Bolshevik Russia in the July 1918 issue of Modern Review. In Modern Review, Rabindranath was saying, "We have heard that modern Russia is floundering in its bottomless abyss of idealism. We know very little of the history of the present revolution of Russia, and with the scanty materials in our hand, all that we can say is that the time to judge has not yet come. It is not unlikely that as a nation she will fail, but if she fails with a flag of true ideals in her hand, her failure will fade." However, after a visit to the Soviet Union, the poet saw in his own eyes the light of new age. I'm quoting him again. The light of new age is his own quotation, his own saying, the dawn of the new civilization. But his fears about the Bolsheviks did not subside. Tagore has never taken a stand permanently. In 1926, in his work Rayoter Kotha in Kalantar, which was published by the then West Bengal government, the poet writes that the Tsarist system of Russia and the Bolshevik system were the part of the body of the same monster. I'm quoting same monster. In the same article, he wrote that, again I'm quoting, "We do not understand the nature of the initiatives that have taken place in the West lately, such as Bolshevism and fascism, but we understand that they are the arena of the collective crime and hooliganism." However, although a few years later, the poet went on a trip to Soviet Union, he wrote an article titled Shomobai, published in Bongobani 3 years ago, where he wrote, "পশ্চিমের মানুষের গায়ের জোরটা বেশি, সেই জন্য গায়ের জোরের উপর তার আস্থাও বেশি, কল্যাণ সাধনেও গায়ের জোর না খাটিয়ে তারা পারে না। রাশিয়ায় সোভিয়েত রাষ্ট্রনীতিতে এই গায়ের জোরের দৃষ্টান্তই দেখতে পাই, কল্যাণের নয়." So see how Tagore was previously praising, later on not praising, again we will see he was praising. So what was his exact standpoint? That is always coming as a question. A year and a half before his trip to Russia in 1919, 9th February, in a speech at Sriniketan, Rabindranath spoke about Soviet policy. He equated Soviet policy with the fascist power and declared it a suicidal form of European civilization, which is found again in Shomobai Niti. By the time more than half a century of Tagore's life has passed, he has traveled to many countries of the world. Despite being on Russia's doorstep several times, he did not have the opportunity to enter the country, or in many cases he did not take advantage of those opportunities. In most cases he avoided the invitation on the pretext of health. As I said already, that Tagore was time and again trying to avoid Russian trip, maybe for his own ideologies, maybe for the ideologies that were told by his surroundings. However, in 1926, 27th September, Vox, which is an international cultural relations association, invited Tagore to visit Soviet Union with an intention to establish and extend cultural relation with foreign countries. Tagore, who was traveling in Europe, was then in Berlin, and he accepted the invitation with thanks. In the Soviet Union, arrangements were all made for Tagore, and that was done with due dignity. A month-long program was adopted during Tagore's stay in the country, but he suddenly again fell ill, and he went to Vienna to consult the doctors. Due to illness, he had to return to the country, leaving the tour of Europe unfinished. The poet did not show interest, as there were 2 more possibilities for a visit to Soviet Union in 1927-28. Arrangements were made for the poet to travel to the Soviet Union during his stay in Geneva in 1930, when he was touring Europe again. Once again, Tagore's friends tried to prevent him, but this time, as we find in Russia's Chichi, Tagore said himself, I'm again quoting, "আবার অনেকে আমাকে ভয় দেখিয়েছে, এমন কথাও বলেছে যে ওরা যা দেখাবে তার অধিকাংশই বানানো, unquote. So in the same work, Tagore said about his own perspectives that it would have been unforgivable for him not to join in spite of being invited to world's largest historical stage event. Prabhat Kumar Mukherjee, the biographer of Tagore, however, cites an important piece of information provided by an American journalist as the main reason for the obstruction. In Rabindra Jivani, 3rd volume, page 166 to 168, we find that Tagore revealed while resting in Geneva that he is heart and soul for the Indian nationalist movement. It is understood it is because of the impetus which his presence might give to a pro-Gandhi sentiment in USA and Russia that the coterie of Englishmen who surrounded him here was continuously against his prison of health. However, this time the poet agreed. Yes, I'm trying. Shomopriya, I'm trying to conclude. This time the poet agreed to go to Russia, and when he went there, he found, although Leningrad, Siberia, these parts were scrapped from the entire tour, but he went to Moscow, and there he found that it was really and highly developed. And there were other reasons for Tagore also not to visit Russia, which was that Tagore mostly was visiting the entire country to raise money for Visva-Bharati, and in Russia there was not much chance of it. And to come here again, I would say, to conclude, it is very important to note that in this context, towards the end of his life, Tagore was getting influenced, and he said in Chithi Patro that মার্কসিজমের ছোঁয়া যদি কারোর কবিতায় লাগে, অর্থাৎ কাব্যের জাত রেখে লাগে, তাহলে আপত্তির কথা নেই. And there is a poem which is overlooked by many in Shamoli called Amrito, which was a great poem where he is writing about the revolutionary who is returning to the country after spreading 8 years in Europe, where he is saying, বুদ্ধির কাঁচা ফলে ঠোকর দিয়েছে রাশিয়ার লক্ষ্মী খেদানো
I would kindly request Prashant.
Yes. I'm just wrapping up.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. And had it been not so that Tagore did not support this idea of Russia towards the end of his life, when Nazi forces were about to begin their invasion in Soviet Union, in Crisis of Civilization, Tagore ultimately said that জীবনের প্রথম আরম্ভে সমস্ত মন থেকে বিশ্বাস করেছিলাম ইউরোপের অন্তরের সম্পদ এই সভ্যতার দানকে, আর আজ আমার বিদায়ের দিনে সে বিশ্বাস একেবারে দেউলিয়া হয়ে গেল যদি রাশিয়া কিছু পারে. So this was the expectation with which Tagore ended. And this particular Shobhota Sankat is written at the very end of his life, where probably he found the hope in Russia. Thank you very much, and sorry for making it so long. Thank you very much. Actually, I omitted so many parts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prashantda. And we now move on to the last speaker for the day, the head of the department, Dr. Madhuchanda Rai Chaudhary. We are taking the questions after this. So after Madhuchanda Rai Chaudhary's paper, we are going to ask Professor Amrit Sen to take over the session. Yes, over to you, Madhuchanda.
Thank you, Moni Kinkini. Am I audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I know I'm the last speaker, so people are at the end of their patience. So I won't try your patience too much. I just want to start my paper with a comment and a disclaimer. The comment being, I have slightly changed the title of my paper. It was called Bare Bones, Exploring the Flip Side of Romanticism's Flip Side. Instead of saying Romanticism's Flip Side, I'm now calling it Bare Bones, Exploring Romanticism's Dark Side in Tagore's Skeleton. That's one. And secondly, I would have to mention that this is a work in progress, so comments, suggestions, and questions would be welcome. Okay, with that, I get into my paper, and I must say that this is going to be more of a talk rather than a formal reading out of the paper. Okay, so to begin, the things that I'm going to focus on. First of all, I'm going to focus on only one short story, that's Skeleton, given the paucity of time. My primary idea is to show the similarity between Tagore's work and the Western tradition of darker aspects of Romanticism, which was primarily explored through the medium of the Gothic, be it Gothic novels or some Gothic poems as well. And I, again, given the paucity of time, I won't be able to get into details of these. But nevertheless, so the first part of my paper or discussion would be about the similarity or the influences that Tagore seemed to be drawing from the tradition of the darker side of Romanticism as explored in the genre of the Gothic, and then how he deviates from this tradition and what this deviation does in terms of giving a new direction, perhaps, to the Bengali supernatural story. So that is, in a nutshell, the crux of what I want to talk about. In terms of exploring the darker side of Romanticism, Dr. Devmalu Chatterjee has very helpfully, already talked about skeleton. So you guys all know that skeleton is primarily concentrated on a conversation between a student who has had some medical training and a ghost whose skeleton actually he used for his medical training. So to explore the darker side of Romanticism, I would be concentrating on the figure of the unnamed woman whose skeleton hangs ultimately in the students, or rather the one's erstwhile students' room. And in exploring that, I would focus on the darker side of a subjective vision of Romanticism, the darker side of imagination, and the fact that the mind itself can actually become a source of entrapment and a myopic vision, which ultimately does not lead to transcendence, but a sense of futility and a sense of deep mortality, and the consequent poignancy. And the deviation from the tradition of dark Romanticism would be dealt with primarily through the trope of skeleton and how Tagore uses it, and how that deviates from the trope of the skeleton as used in Gothic fiction, and also through the presentation of the unnamed narrator and his attitudes. So that's a breakup of what I'm going to talk about. So let's very briefly talk about what exactly I mean by the darker side of Romanticism as explored in the Gothic fiction. As we all know, Romanticism focused on a world of subjective creation, where the mind creates the world around us. And that is a world that enables us to transcend the unsavory aspects of the mortal existence that we have, and therefore literally enables us to soar beyond the mundane and the banal. And that becomes a sort of spiritual flight, which is a pathway and a window to attaining higher spiritual truths. In contrast to that, darker side of Romanticism explores the narcissistic aspect, the egoistic aspect of this kind of romantic imagination, where the mind, instead of achieving a flight, gets caught up in its own little in its own little vicious cycle, and therefore begins to breed terror, claustrophobia, specters of its own. This is the Western tradition. And as I said, I won't go into details. This is something that is found very potently in Mary Shelley's work, Frankenstein, and her short story Transformation, and also in Byron's Manfred, where the eponymous protagonist of the story, Manfred, is literally a man who can control all the worlds, but it is his mind which becomes the point of torture. So he can control the specters, he can control the netherworld, he has the magical power to control everything, but it is his own mind that keeps on haunting him with a secret guilt which he cannot control and which ultimately leads to his death. He longs for death as a sort of, end to the misery and the pain that is going through, that he is going through. And that pain and that misery comes from the fact that he's trapped in his own mind. So being trapped in your own mind is not always a happy thing as far as dark Romanticism is concerned and as far as Gothic stories are concerned. And if we come to Gothic fiction, Radcliffe explores the terror that imagination itself breeds. So why is Radcliffe different from the first dawns of Gothic fiction like Horace Walpole? Because Horace Walpole gives us very visible ghosts, skeletons and, hands flying all over and so on and so forth. Quite ridiculous if you read Horace Walpole at this point in time. But Anne Radcliffe focuses much more on the tricks that your own mind play with you, and therefore the darker side of imagination, where your imagination can become more scary because it breeds specters which might not even be there. And therefore the tradition of the explained supernatural, where Radcliffe ultimately explains that, there was no really real ghost, it was all in the heroine's mind. Anyway, just to quote from a famous critic called G.R. This is G.R. Thompson in his from his introduction to Introduction to Romanticism and the Gothic Tradition, and the name of the book is The Gothic Imagination: Essays in Dark Romanticism, where G.R. Thompson says that in the absence of any satisfactory theory that accounted for the existence of evil and pain, the Gothic tale could at least embody the world felt, if not perceived, as the mind. If Romanticism is largely a philosophy of consciousness, dark Romanticism is a drama of the mind engaged in the quest for metaphysical and moral absolutes in a world that offers shadowy semblances of an occult order, but withholds final revelation or illumination. So that's G.R. Thompson for you. Now, how does this idea of the darker aspect of Romanticism operate in Konkal or skeleton? If we look at the woman, she is extremely conscious of the fact that she is a very, very beautiful woman. And she is in love with herself, love with her own beauty, and therefore quite narcissistic. Now, the ramifications of narcissism and egotism have been very, very well explored in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I'm certainly not going to go into a discussion of Frankenstein because this is not the time or this place. But if you look at the short story Konkal, the woman says that when she, by the way, she is, Dr. Demala Chatterjee has already mentioned what Konkal is all about. I must just mention that this woman who is at the center of the short story Konkal happens to be a young widow who was thrown out of her in-laws' house because her husband died within a few months of her wedding, and they thought that she was a poison ivy. So they threw her out, and she happily goes back to her, father's house or, parents' house. But this is what she says, and she's quite happy there, and she often decks herself up and sits quietly in the garden. And this is what she says about that part. She says, just give me a second. Sorry. Just give me 1 second. I'm just trying to find out the exact place. Anyway, I'm just, she says that I felt that all nature was in love with me. I used to sit, I quote from the short story, she says, I used to sit under a tree in the garden and imagine that the whole of nature was in love with me, that all the stars were eyeing me, that the wind was sidling past me, sighing deeply, that the grass on which my legs were stretched out would, were it conscious, quickly soon to unconsciousness again. I supposed that all world's young men were silently assembled round my feet like a clump of grass. What senseless anguish I felt. Right? So you can clearly see that she is extremely narcissistic. And then she happens to fall in love with a doctor who is the only male member she is really in contact with, apart from her brother. And the doctor happens to be the brother's friend. And in her imagination, once again, it is not the doctor, it is not like she is imagining her lover in that sense, but she is, once again, it's the self which kind of splits into two. And she says that from that moment, there were two of us instead of one. And I would imagine, as I dressed up and, took my, walked across the garden, I would see two footsteps. In other words, I would see myself through the doctor's eyes, or how the doctor would see me. So once again, you see, it is she who is imagining what the doctor is supposed to imagine, or how the doctor is supposed to see her. She says that from that time onwards, I was no longer alone. When I walked, casting my eyes down to look at the way my toes pressed the ground, I wondered how our newly qualified doctor would like my footsteps. In the afternoon, when the heat shimmered outside the window and there were no sound except the cry of a kite flying high, I would spread out a clean sheet and lie down. I would stretch a naked arm casually across my soft bed and pretend that a certain someone had seen my arm, and the way I stretched it out, had lifted it up in both hands, had planted a kiss on my pink palm, and had crept out again. What would you think of the story if it ended here? Anyway, so this is how she's imagining. And then she learns that the doctor is going to get married off. Obviously, she can't do anything about it. So she ultimately commits suicide. But I just want to read out the part right before her suicide, where she deliberately puts on a very delicate smile on her face, thinking that that is the image which is going to be preserved post-mortem or post-death. And she says, my wish was that when people came and found me, that slight smile would still be intoxicatingly present on my red lips. My wish was that when I slowly entered my bridal chamber of eternal light, I would take that smile with me. But where was the bridal chamber? Where was my bridal attire? Woken by a clattering sound within me, I found 3 boys learning anatomy from me. In a breast that had throbbed with joy and sorrow, where daily the petals of youth had unfolded one by one, a teacher was pointing out with his cane which bone was which, and what trace was there now of the final smile I had formed with my lips. There you have the critique of the narcissism that dark romanticism indulges in, that Gothic also as a genre indulges in, that the vanity of creating a subjective world and hoping that that subjective world is going to endure and give you a sense of transcendence. So what happens in this case with the woman is that instead of that beautiful smile, all that she is left with is the toothy, horrible grin of the skeleton. Right? And this is the point from which the deviation starts with Tagore. So therefore, you see that the skeleton here is not the same trope as you find in the Gothic fiction. Because here, the skeleton in Gothic fiction is often the source of macabre horror. And we can go all the way back to Horace Walpole, where a skeletal monk appears in a cowl and scares the daylights out of everybody, especially out of a particular villain, and brings him back to his senses. And he doesn't kind of indulge in the wicked deeds that he had imagined that he would do. So therefore, the skeleton or the spectre, yes, I will wrap it up in 5 minutes. There we see that the skeleton or the spectre becomes both a didactic means of restoring the moral order and also a sheer source of horror. Here, on the contrary, the skeleton becomes, one, a utilitarian object, and secondly, a rude slap on the idea that human beings are immortal, or we can be immortalized in any which way, or most importantly, that our beauty can be immortalized in any which way. So therefore, the sheer, futility of human existence is being highlighted, as well as the utilitarian aspect of the skeleton, which is what I'm emphasizing, because this is again a deviation. So, and then there is the discourse with the ghost, which is again a parting from the Western tradition, because there is a distinct fear of the ghost. You don't discourse with the ghost. Okay, here we have a discourse, a proper discourse with the ghost. And finally, the narrator, who seems to be caught between the world of romantic imagination and the skepticism of a rationalist who has gained his rationalism and skepticism, ironically, from a Western education epitomized by the medical training provided by the skeleton. And since I don't have time, maybe in the question answer session, I can go into the specific sectors. So I won't quote from the text, but there are sections in the text where the narrator says, where, she asks that, what if my story had stopped at this point where I had fallen in love with the doctor? And the narrator says, not bad, still a bit incomplete, but I would happily spend the rest of the night finishing it off in my mind. So clearly, this narrator is not unimaginative. In fact, when the story starts, he imagines, and then he says, oh, why should I be scared of the creation of my own imagination? There you have the deviation from the tradition of dark romanticism that Tagore indulges in. So I would finally end with the irony that Tagore is bringing into the supernatural, where he's borrowing from a Western tradition, and then he's deliberately using a narrator trained in Western education and the ensuing skepticism that rationalist training brings in to kind of subvert or bring a new dimension to the Western European tradition, a Western English tradition of darker side of romanticism, specifically the Gothic. I hope I've ended in time.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank God.
Over to you. With that, we have finished with the papers. Over to you, Professor Amrit Sen.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Right. Thank you, everybody. It's been a very rich haul of 8 papers, which have talked about Tagore's different aspects. Obviously, as was pointed out, the ghost stories have been discussed threadbare. I especially like the way in which both the Gothic and the subversion of the Western tradition of the ghost story was discussed in the 2 very excellent papers. There's a very thorough discussion on the Bolshevik illusion, as was called, and the way in which there was a proactive build-up of the idea of Russia and Rabindranath's encounter with it. I was also very interested to see how Rabindranath as a post-nationalist was discussed in a paper along with the discussion of cosmopolitanism. In fact, while Martha Nussbaum was discussing cosmopolitanism in her own work in response to Richard Rorty, you remember that she starts off by discussing the home and the world. So once again, the eco-vision is also another important aspect, which I think English translations have scarcely looked at. So it's a very rich compendium of papers that we have had looking at this myriad-mindedness of Tagore. And I'm glad really because, in a way it has taken us to a different Tagore than we normally see in his poetry. Right. With that, let me open this up for questions. I'm looking at my chat box. Unfortunately, what is happening is that because this is from the phone that I'm doing, there was frequent disconnection. So maybe if you have questions, I would request you to unmute yourself and put them to the paper presenters. Right. I'm sorry, I don't have all the questions in my chat.
Amrita, just to intervene, our students have kept a track of the questions that were there in the chat box. And I think one of them, Shravasti, you can just paste the questions in the chat box so that everybody can see.
Right. Meanwhile, there was this question by Sanjana to Madhu Chanda, which asks, do you think Tagore's preoccupation with death has to do with his wife's suicide? Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much for the question. okay, this might be my personal bias, but I'm always a bit skeptical about going into biographical criticism. So I don't know. The short answer is I don't know, but I don't think we should limit any artist for that matter to simply biography, because I think Tagore, or any artist for that matter, especially Tagore, would go it because see, the point is, if we go into saying that Tagore's preoccupation with death primarily deals with his wife's suicide, then what do we do with Kadambari Devi's suicide, right? What do we do with the fact that he lost so many of his children? So I don't think we can specify one person in terms of Tagore's vision of death, because he had been so much been through so much in his personal life. I think death and life in many ways intertwined with Tagore, because even in his song, Amar Praner Pore Chole Gelo Ke, Boshanter Batash Tukur Moto, which I think, Amrit sir, please correct me and, don't scold me if I'm wrong, but I don't know if, was it written after, I believe it was written after Kadambari Devi's death, was it? Or am I wrong?
There's no suicide of the wife, incidentally. The wife was, she died from an illness.
I was referring
to Kadambari Devi's suicide.
I was a bit confused about that too. Sorry for my limited knowledge of Tagore, but yeah, I thought that his wife was, anyway. So the point is that the idea of death, sometimes Tagore is talking about death as his praner shokha. So as a lover. Sometimes he's talking about death as such a cruel thing where all of nature seems to be going on just as usual while I have lost a loved one. So Tagore has different visions of death. So I think it would be very limiting to say that Tagore's obsession with death was only because of Kadambari's suicide, or for that matter, his wife's death. So I hope that...
I would like to intervene, because Sanjana has put forward that question. You see, Tagore had a procession of deaths across a long period of time. And he, in fact, there is a song which compares death to Maronohe to Humamo Shamo Shaman. So he refers to death as a constant companion, as it were. So, and there was a sequence of deaths. In fact, Rabindranath Tagore, his Nati, as it were, his grandson would die in his final years. So, and he, not only his relatives, but also a large number of his associates passed away. So, in that sense, there is this presence of death and the transcendence of death, as it were, in Tagore as a constant theme, as you will remember. So, and being, and from his philosophy, Rabindranath would treat death as part of this life cycle. So in a way, when Madhuchanda was talking about romanticism and the way in which, Keats accepts death as a part of the life cycle, and the Konkal being, part and parcel of an existence which is beyond life, as it were, I think ties it up very nicely with the idea of the romantic, the idea that Madhuchanda was talking about. So, thank you. I'm sorry, I just stepped over a little boundaries. But any other questions which are posted? Unfortunately, what has happened is that the first two papers have had such a long gap that some of the questions have been probably missed. But there's one question by Devina Gupta who says, while Tagore was against machine-centric industrial capitalism, he was at the same time critical of Swadeshi nationalism and its expensive Swadeshi goods versus cheaper machine-made goods. How would we then locate the economic vision of Tagore for India and the world? That's a nice question. Would you like to take it up, the first speakers? Animesh would, no, not Animesh probably. Sanjana and...
yes, sir.
And maybe, maybe, yeah, I think Sanjana would like to answer that, and Monica, if you can. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I think that Tagore realized that one factor that resulted in British domination over India's economy was the use of machines for production. So he puts forward the idea that if machines are used judiciously to produce Swadeshi goods, then it would result a great deal into boosting India's economy. And he was also considerate for the rural population's employment too at the same time. But he was also against the idea that machines should not dominate the humans in their employment. So his total vision for the economy was a sensible blend of machine and Swadeshi to improve the economy of India and along with giving employment to the large rural population, for which he also used to organize fairs. So this is my response. I hope I answered it.
Okay, would anybody like to respond to the question? Because that's a very interesting question that was asked. Anybody else among the speakers? Well, I'd just like to make one observation. You see that, largely Rabindranath's economic vision was one of bringing technology and economic self-independence. In fact, in Swadeshi Samaj, he largely talks about this concept of Atma-Shakti to the villages and to the Indian economic system, as it were. But having said that, Rabindranath realized that if the Swadeshi movement insisted on creating goods that were out of reach of the common man, then the people who would suffer would be the poor peasants. And this is the point that is harped on in The Home and the World. Therefore, Tagore adopted technology. In fact, he was one of the major proponents of technology in agriculture, both in Bangladesh, erstwhile East Bengal, and in Shantiniketan also. And what he was against was probably the spirit of the machine entering into humanity and the way in which
Monikinkini, I can't hear Amrit sir. Is something wrong?
I think there's something wrong with the connection.
Oh dear, again.
Hello?
Hello?
Amrita, can you hear us?
No, yeah, he's back. Amrita, sorry.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat the last part because we lost you there?
Oh, I'm so sorry. You see, the point being, I was talking about, Rabindranath and Gandhiji's debate on the charkha and the way in which, Gandhiji was on the point of rejecting everything that was machine-made and almost prioritizing a movement away from technology, as it were. Rabindranath never said that. Rabindranath suggested, as I pointed out, that, the machine must not enter the human heart, as it were. And the machine must not be used as an agent of exploitation, but he welcomed the infusion of technology. In fact, when in Jatrar Purvapatra, which he writes as a kind of a preface to Pathesh Sanchaya, the travelogue, Gleanings from the Road, he suggests that, technology has made the West better. And we need to understand from the West what and how technology must be used. At the same time, retaining our own distance from the machine in terms of allowing it to take over. And that is a point which he harps, all the time in nationalism as to when, the machine becomes a monster, which and feeds into nation and imperialism. So it's Rabindranath was presenting a very nuanced and complicated economic vision. It wasn't very simple, as it were. It wasn't like just Swadeshi or just a boycott would help the Indian economic cause. Right. Thank you. Any other? Let me see if there are any other questions in the chat box. There's another question for Madhuchanda, which asks whether the narrator is trapped in his own imagination. As you mentioned that he's imaginative and is also saying why I should be afraid of my own question.
Yes. Well, I think that is where Tagore is deviating, because and that is why he's creating a narrator who's kind of caught between the excesses of a Byronic hero or a Frankenstein, and someone who's completely skeptic, someone who's completely cynical. Now, if he did not have imagination, he would not have seen the ghost, or the ghost would not have talked to him. But at the same time, if he had not been critical or skeptical, in fact, Amrita, if you indulge me, I'll just quote a little bit from the text.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
In fact, this is something that I did not have time to talk about in my presentation, and this is something that I was discussing with Shubir sir as well. If you read the English translation, you get a very different idea about the narrator, primarily because Radice, I mean, I shouldn't probably be commenting on a scholar like Radice, but Radice says, at the very end, where once the story is over, the ghost says, "How did you find my story?" And Radice says, Radice quotes a narrator as saying, "Hilarious," I replied. "The first crow cawed, and are you still there?" I asked. There was no reply. Dawn light was entering the room. That is how the story ends. Now, I just want to read out from the Bengali story, the original Bengali story. There it says, গল্পটা কেমন লাগলো? আমি বললাম, গল্পটি বেশ প্রফুল্লকর. Profulokor certainly does not translate as hilarious. Profulokor may be, I was just looking at, Bengali to English dictionary. Profulokor might translate as cheerful, as gay, but certainly not as hilarious. So the narrator, in that sense, is a figure who does not necessarily represent dark romanticism. And this is why Tagore's vision is more complicated. So it is not just dark romanticism. He is borrowing the critique of the excesses of romanticism from the tradition of dark romanticism. But then he is also combining it with the tradition of objective skepticism that is a legacy of the English educated Indian, and that is how he is creating his own narrator. And this narrator, by the way, is a kind of a naive person. He doesn't necessarily completely want to lose his imagination either. He does not want to become a dry, reasoning machine, so to speak. But he's caught in two worlds, in between two worlds, if you will. I mean, I don't know if that answers the question.
Right. Thank you. I personally would like to ask a question to Shoikot. No, I'm sorry, Prashanto. Is Prashanto there by any chance? Dr. Ghoshal? Are you there?
I don't think he is there, sir. I think he has some connectivity.
Yeah. So anyways.
No, Prashanto has been...
I think he has left a message with the DESNU group. He is having some family exigencies, and because of that, he had to leave.
Okay. Any other questions that people would like to post? Anything else? You might unmute yourself and ask.
Question to Devmallu.
Yeah, Shubita, please go ahead. Right.
Yes, sir. I'm on. Hello. I'm on.
Yeah, Shubita, if you please ask the question. We can't reach Shubita.
Monikinkini, I think sir has somehow...
I'd like to ask
there it is. There.
Sir is there.
Indian classical aesthetic tradition, the Rasa theories, obviously. Now, but do you think that Tagore is creating a kind of a bridge between Indian aesthetic theory and Western ideology of the Gothic and the uncanny?
Right, sir. He's creating a different variety of Gothic tradition in the short stories. Because in Western Gothic tradition, we are a bit within the boundary of the major themes or the card themes. But in Rabindranath Tagore short story, we find the variability, we find the differential aspects of Gothic fiction. Because in Conquer, in the conversational mode utilized by the author is able to make comic anecdotes. The skeleton, the speaker, the supernatural speaker, is actually mocking life. The speaker is actually creating its own variety, its own type, its own subjectivity, so that only the Gothic themes are not within the boundary. They should not be within the boundary. With the utilization of the Singara Rasa, the erotic flavor is framed. The erotic flavor is brought into a question. It is being brought into spotlight. So it is being illuminated. So as well as I'll talk about Chudito Pashan, the hungry stones. In this short story, we find that the stones are not exactly hungry. There is a hidden message in the story. There is a strong sense of sexuality. There is a strong sense of forbidden pleasure. The stones, within these stones, to speak in Bengali, এই পাষাণের মধ্যে এক ধরনের হৃদয় আটকে আছে, যে হৃদয়গুলো একটা এক্সপোজার চায়, they want an exposure. That's why the stones are hungry. আমরা দেখেছি, it's better to speak in Bengali to answer my question. That's why I'm speaking Bengali. The narrator or the tax collector, when he's having these experiences, he's always feeling a kind of romanticism, a kind of pleasure that is actually encircling him. And it is Chudito Pashan. Why are the stones hungry? The stones are hungry because these pleasures, these insights, these senses are being trapped under these stones. So the speaker is saying about this. So in Tagore's short story, we find that unlike the Western tradition, in Gothic fiction there should be more variability. I have restricted myself within the short stories of Rabindranath Tagore for my discussion on Gothic literature. But if we see Gothic literature in total, we find that there are more varieties. When we start with Castle of Otranto, as Morshabadi said, that it appears very funny. It appears very funny because there are some magical events. But if we look at the later Gothic novels, we find there are much more variability. Gothic is not at all, in a sense, Gothic in that respect. We read Gothic literature within the very periphery, but Gothic is not at all that. Gothic is something that is beyond. As I have said, that irrationality, as the speaker is able to, most of the time Conquer, the speaker is the supernatural spirit. So the supernatural spirit, in Western fiction, we find that the supernatural spirit speaks less. But in Rabindranath Tagore's short story, we find that the speaker is taking much of the time. This is actually showing that Gothic cannot be restricted within the domains propagated by Western theorizations on Gothic. I hope, sir, answered. Hello.
For your response, Dibmallo. There's another question. Can I put forward another question for Sanjana? There's a question from Spandan who asks, do you think cosmopolitanism leads to patriotism? Is patriotism really in contradiction with cosmopolitanism? Is Sanjana there?
Yes, sir.
Right. Would you like to respond to that?
I personally believe that in The Home and the World, Tagore highlights this particular question particularly, the contradiction between the patriotism and cosmopolitanism. What he is against is not patriotism, but the destructive patriotism that leads to militant violence and no heed paid to the humane aspect of the situation. So his idea of patriotism deals with being a citizen of the world rather than just limited to the boundaries. I hope I answered it.
Right. Okay. Any other questions? I saw somebody unmuting herself. Would anybody like to put any other questions? No? Well, then it's been an enchanting session, really, from the ecology to the ghost, from the nation to the post-nation and beyond. Some excellent presentations. Excellent question and answer session also. So with that, I would like to thank all the paper presenters, the people who asked questions, and in general, everybody who's kept time and coordinated this. And with that, I would like to hand over the session once again to Dr. Monikin Bush.
Thank you, Amrita. I'm not yet a doctor.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Anyway, soon be. Soon.
Yeah, hoping in the next year maybe you will call me doctor. Anyway, thank you. I would invite Professor Shubidhar to kindly conclude the session with his kind words of erudition. Sir, would you please?
Yes, I will. But before that, I think, the last word should be yours, Monikin, the vote of thanks. But to everyone present here and to those who had logged in and had to log out, well, technology was not on our side. We had disruptions, power failures, voice offs, voice ins, almost every kind of problem. But I think we soldiered on. We went on, and we have come successfully to the end of this day, which is the second day of our clustered webinar series on Rabindranath Tagore. We have learned a great deal, and not the least from our keynote presenter, Professor. Starting from the morning with his very informative and fascinating till the end, all the paper presenters have literally taught us a great deal about the multifaceted genius of Rabindranath Tagore. From ecology to one of the least regarded novels of Tagore, from the Gothic to nationalism and to fascism and communism, we have really moved across acres of intellectual territory, and we are enriched by this. Tomorrow is the third day of our clustered webinar, and tomorrow we focus on Tagore's drama. And before anything else, I'd like to hand over once again to Monikin Kini for the concluding remarks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for being there, always supporting us in every endeavor that we try to take, for brainchilding all the projects that we are at the present moment entered into. I would like to extend my gratitude to the head of the department, Dr. Madhuchanda Rai Chaudhary, for her endless support, endless work and overwork rather, because being the head, she has so many administrative works as well. I would like to extend my thanks to the colleagues that are towers of Dr. Prashanta Ghoshal, Dr. Sudesha Das. This time I got the correct surname. So pardon me for that mistake in the morning. And of course, thanks to who have actually gone out of their way in helping their professors in dealing with all these technical issues. Thank you. Thank you so much, my students. We are very, very happy to have you as our children. And Thank you to the technical team, to Professor Orkoprovo Chakraborty, faculty member of Sister Nivedita University, for his tireless streaming of this entire webinar on our DESNU YouTube channel. Orko, would you please show your face like yesterday?